On an October day in the year 1553, on a dusty plain in the heart of Anatolia, an old man sat in a great tent of red and gold and waited for his son to arrive. The son came gladly. He was the most admired prince in the empire, brave, gifted, beloved of the vast army that was camped all around them, and he had been summoned to his father's tent to answer a whisper of treason that he knew to be false. He trusted his own innocence, he trusted his father, and so he rode into the camp without fear, and he was shown through into the inner tent, and there, upon the order of the father who waited only a few feet away, he was killed. The father was Suleiman the Magnificent, 10th Sultan of the House of Osman and the most powerful man alive on the earth. And the story you are about to hear is not the golden one carved upon his monuments. That golden story is real, and we will tell all of it. The conqueror at the gates of Vienna, the lawgiver who gave his name to an entire age, the patron of a civilization at the very summit of its powers, the Sultan who wrote tender love poems in his own hand under a secret name. Every word of it is true. None of it is the whole truth, because the golden age had a shadow, and the shadow fell across his own tent. This was a man of genuine and enormous greatness whose private life became a chain of self-inflicted catastrophes. The friend he had strangled, the son he destroyed, the family he could not save from itself, the empire he left standing at its zenith already carrying, in those very acts, the seeds of its long decline. The most magnificent of sultans was also the loneliest, and he had made himself so. To understand the son, you must first stand in the shadow of the father. In the autumn of 1520, when couriers carried the news across Anatolia that Sultan Selim I was dead, the men who heard it are said to have wept, and some of them, very quietly, to have breathed out. For 8 years Selim had ruled the Ottoman Empire the way a storm rules a coastline. His own people called him Yavuz, a word gentled in translation to the grim, though it carried something closer to the inflexible, the ferocity of a man who did not bend. He had come to the throne by forcing the abdication of his own father and by clearing away every rival within the family, in the pitiless custom of a dynasty that had long treated its succession as a fight to the death. And then he had turned that same ferocity outward upon the world. In 1514 he shattered the armies of Safavid Persia at Chaldiran. 2 years later he fell upon the Mamluk Sultanate that had ruled Egypt and Syria for 2.5 centuries, and in a single astonishing campaign he destroyed it, taking Damascus and Cairo and the whole of the Levant, and with them the guardianship of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina and the vast prestige of the Caliphate itself. In 8 years upon the throne, Selim the Grim had very nearly doubled the size of the empire and made its sultan the foremost sovereign of the Muslim world. He had done it with a coldness that became proverbial. There was a grim joke in the palace that to be raised to the office of Selim's grand vizier was very nearly a sentence of death, so many of them did he destroy. This was the inheritance. This was the father, and it is against the black cliff of that reputation that we must set the son. Into this house of conquest and fear, a boy had been born on the 6th of November, 1494, in the Black Sea city of Trabzon, where Selim was then serving as a provincial governor far from the throne he would one day seize. The boy's mother was Hafsa Sultan. A later tradition would make her a princess of the Crimean Tatars, though modern historians treat the claim with caution, and much about her origin remains genuinely uncertain. The child was named Suleiman, the Turkish form of Solomon, the wise king and lawgiver of scripture, a name that would prove, across the 70 years to come, almost unbearably apt. He was raised as an Ottoman prince was raised, in the disciplined world of the palace, in the study of the Quran and the sacred law, of Persian and Arabic, of poetry and history, and the arts of war and government. And in the ordinary apprenticeship of a Shehzad, a prince of the blood, he was sent out young to govern provinces in his father's name. While still a youth, he held Kaffa, the great port on the Crimean coast. Later, he governed Manisa in western Anatolia, the traditional proving ground of Ottoman heirs, with his mother Hafsa beside him to order his household. There, in miniature and at a safe distance from the center of power, he learned the thing he would spend the rest of his life doing. He learned how to rule. He grew, by the testimony of those who saw him, into a grave and reserved young man, more drawn to books and to the quiet company of a few close intimates than to spectacle or display, a temperament the world would badly misread. And then, in September of 1520, Selim the Grim died of an infection, on the road, still restless, still said to be planning fresh campaigns, and the single most important fact of Suleiman's life quietly revealed itself. He was alone. The father, whose ruthlessness had terrified an empire, had also, by that very ruthlessness, swept clean the ground around his heir. Of all the brothers and cousins and rival princes who in another generation might have contested the throne with fire and sword, Suleiman was the only one left standing. There was no war of succession. There was no fratricide, no desperate race of armed princes toward the capital. There was only a grave young man of 25 who rode into Constantinople and who, without a single blade lifted against him, was girded with the sword of his ancestors and sat down upon the throne of the House of Osman as its 10th Sultan. The empire he now commanded was already among the great powers of the earth, a realm that stretched from the Danube to the deserts of Arabia, from the mountains of the Balkans to the waters of the Nile, binding together Turks and Greeks, Arabs and Slavs, Kurds and Armenians, Muslims and Christians and Jews beneath a single throne. Its heart was Constantinople, the city his great-grandfather Mehmed the Conqueror had wrested from the last of the Roman emperors only 67 years before, and which the Ottomans had since made the capital of a new and hungry world empire. From the palace of Topkapi set above the meeting of the waters where Europe and Asia regard each other across a narrow strait, the young sultan could look out upon dominions no Christian king alive could rival. He was now their master. He was also, though almost no one yet suspected it, the man who would enlarge them beyond anything even his fearsome father had dared to imagine. His first acts surprised everyone. Where his father had governed by terror, the young sultan opened his reign with deliberate gestures of justice that rippled outward through the bazaars and chanceries of the world. He freed hundreds of merchants, Egyptian, Persian, and others, whom Selim had seized and imprisoned, and he returned their confiscated goods. He punished officials who had abused their offices. He made a careful public show of a sovereign who intended to rule by law rather than by fear. To the peoples of the empire it looked like mercy, and it was mercy. It was also the opening move of a lifelong political intelligence, the same instinct that would one day earn him, among the Turks, the name by which they still know him best, Kanunî the Lawgiver. Europe saw only the mercy and drew the wrong conclusion, for the world watched the new sultan and the world misread him. In the courts of Christian Europe, worn down and frightened by a decade of Selim's conquests, the death of the grim sultan and the accession of his untested son were received almost as a reprieve. Here, surely, was a softening, a young, bookish, untried prince, gentler than his father, a calm after the long storm. The ambassadors of Venice, who watched the Ottoman court more closely than anyone in the West, sent home careful, faintly hopeful reports of a ruler who seemed grave, serious, well-read, perhaps mild, perhaps even weak. They were half right about the man and entirely wrong about what he would do. They were looking at a scholar and a poet, and they wholly failed to see the conqueror standing inside the same skin. For Suleiman had inherited far more than territory from his father. He had inherited the empire's restless, expanding engine, the finest standing army in the world, a treasury swollen with the gold of conquered Egypt, and a dynasty that measured the worth of a sultan by the ground he could take, and he fully intended to use it. At his side in those first days stood a young man almost exactly his own age, a companion he had known and loved since the two of them were little more than boys. His name was Ibrahim. He had been born a Christian on the Greek coast, taken as a child in a raid, sold into slavery, and raised within the Ottoman household, and he had risen by nothing but his own gifts, his quickness, his charm, his mastery of languages and music and men, into the innermost circle of the prince's affection. Where Suleiman went, Ibrahim went. They dined together, they talked, it was said, deep into the night. The Sultan lodged his friend close to his own quarters. Already Suleiman was raising him, favor upon favor, office upon office, with a swiftness that unsettled older and greater men at the court, who watched the Sultan's inseparable companion climb and quietly wondered where and whether his rise would ever stop. In all the empire there was no bond quite like it, and no one who watched the two young men together in the bright autumn of 1520 could have begun to imagine how it would one day end. He was 25 years old, and the courts of Europe that watched him take the throne expected very little, a gentle successor to a terrible father, a quiet after the storm. They did not understand what they were looking at. Within a year, the oldest Christian bulwark on the Danube would fall to him. Within 2, the banner of the Knights of St. John would come down over Rhodes, and the mild prince would show Europe a conqueror it had not faced since his great-grandfather took Constantinople. The magnificence had already begun. The shadow would take longer to find him, but it was there in the house from the very first day, and its name, just now, was that of his dearest friend. The mildness of the young prince had been a kind of mask, not a deliberate deception, but a stillness that the watchers of Europe mistook for weakness. The ambassadors resident in Constantinople, those masters of observation who lived by the reports they sent home to Venice, to Rome, and to the Habsburg courts, had studied the new Sultan and seen mostly the reflection of their own hopes. They wanted a prince who would turn inward, who would spend the tremendous inheritance of Selim the Grim on the quiet luxuries of the palace and the refinements of the court. They took restraint for softness and patience for the absence of ambition. Within a single year they would understand how completely they had misread him. By the spring of 1521 the season of waiting was over. The Sultan was barely 6 months into his reign, and he did not linger over the ceremonies of the capital or defer to the old ministers of his father. He turned his attention north and west, up the long corridor of the Danube, toward a fortress that had shadowed the Ottoman imagination for 2 generations. Belgrade stood where the Sava pours into the Danube, a great citadel on a bluff above the meeting of the waters, the northern gate of the Balkans, and the key to the Hungarian plain that lay beyond it. It had defied the House of Osman before. Mehmed the Conqueror, the man who had taken Constantinople itself, had been thrown back from these walls in 1456, and the memory of that repulse had hardened Belgrade into a symbol, the place where the Ottoman tide had once broken and receded. That defense, led by the Hungarian captain John Hunyadi and preached by the friar John of Capistrano, had been hailed across Christendom as a deliverance. By a tradition still repeated, the ringing of church bells at noon was ordained to mark the victory that had saved Belgrade, and Hungary behind it, from the conqueror. For 65 years the fortress had stood as the standing proof that the Ottoman advance could be halted. To take it would be to erase that memory and to announce in the plainest language a sultan possessed that a new reign had come. Suleiman moved with a speed and a method that unsettled his enemies. He came not with the swagger of a young man hunting glory, but with the grinding efficiency of a great state at war. His army was an instrument of logistics as much as of arms, moving tens of thousands of men, heavy siege guns, and mountains of supply through the difficult country of the Balkans on a schedule. When the Ottoman forces closed upon Belgrade in the heat of that summer, the garrison found itself facing not a raid but a system. The batteries were sited with intent, the trenches advanced by design. The island that lay in the confluence and shielded the town was seized first, so that the guns could be brought to bear from the water and the land at once. The Hungarian magnates, quarreling among themselves, sent no relief. Under a steady, methodical bombardment, the defenses were worn away, and in August the fortress that had turned back the conqueror surrendered to his great-grandson. With Belgrade taken, the middle Danube lay open, and the road that ran to Buda and past it to Vienna was no longer a line drawn on a map. It was a route down which an army could march. A part of the city's population was carried back into the empire and resettled near the capital, in the manner the Ottomans used to bind a conquered people to the state, and a garrison was planted in the citadel to hold what had been won. There was, in the manner of these victories, a foretaste of the ruler he would become. The same mind that placed each battery and held each commander to account would, in the years ahead, set itself to the ordering of an empire's law. The discipline that reduced Belgrade was of a piece with the discipline that would one day earn him the name of Lawgiver. He did not conquer as a raider conquers, in a rush of plunder and retreat, but as an administrator conquers, methodically and to keep. But a sultan who meant to command the southern seas could not leave that flank exposed, and one splinter had festered in the Ottoman side for 2 centuries. On the island of Rhodes, off the southwestern shoulder of Anatolia, the Knights of St. John, the Hospitallers, the last of the great crusading orders still holding a realm of its own, commanded one of the strongest fortresses in the world, which they had held for more than 200 years. They had come to the island in the opening years of the 14th century, after the last Christian foothold in the Holy Land was lost, and had made of it a Christian bastion in a Muslim sea. And they had beaten back the Ottomans before. 2 generations earlier, in 1480, the same Mehmed the Conqueror who had failed at Belgrade had thrown an army against Rhodes and been repulsed beneath its walls, so that the island, like the great fortress on the Danube, stood among the few places that had turned away the mightiest of Suleiman's forebears. From that harbor their galleys preyed upon Ottoman shipping, raided the Anatolian coast, and intercepted the merchants and pilgrims bound for the ports of Egypt and the holy cities his father had won only 5 years before. To the Sultan they were an intolerable obstruction, set athwart the sea lanes of his new southern empire. In the summer of 1522, he launched against them an amphibious expedition on a scale that dwarfed anything his predecessors had attempted at sea. The numbers the sources report vary so wildly. Some speak of 100,000 men and many hundreds of ships, others of a smaller, if still enormous host, that no exact figure can be trusted. What is certain is that the disproportion was vast, for against this armament the Grand Master, Philippe Villiers de l'Isle Adam, could set only a few hundred knights and some thousands of local militia and hired soldiers. What followed was not a swift storm, but a siege of months, a contest of engineering and endurance. The island became a country of gun smoke and turned earth. Ottoman miners drove their tunnels beneath the great bastions that the several tongues of the order, its national divisions, each defended, and the knights countermined to meet them in the dark below. The walls were battered and breached and stormed, and still they held. Summer gave way to autumn, and autumn to the edge of winter, and the citadel did not fall. Through the long weeks, the Sultan directed the operation from his camp, in constant consultation with his commanders, and through those same weeks, one man was seldom far from him. Ibrahim, the companion of his youth, raised alongside him, bound to him by an intimacy the court had already begun to remark upon, served at his side throughout the campaign, lodged near the Sultan's own quarters, and trusted with his counsel. The chroniclers of the reign record that closeness without ever quite explaining it, a servant treated as a second self, whose nearness to the sovereign was a thing the whole army could see. What passed between the two men in private, no honest record preserves. What the army saw was plain enough, that the Sultan kept his friend beside him, in the field as in the palace. By December, the defenders of Rhodes had reached the limit of what flesh and stone could bear. The fortifications were shattered, the powder was low, and the knights were too few to hold the length of their own walls. It was then that the young Sultan employed a second instrument of statecraft as deliberately as he had employed his artillery. Rather than storm the ruin and put the survivors to the sword, he offered terms. On the last day of December 1522, after a siege of close to 6 months, the surrender was agreed. The knights were granted 12 days to make ready and were to depart with their lives, their arms, their sacred relics, and the honors of war. The townspeople who wished to leave might go, and those who stayed were promised their churches and a term of exemption from tribute. When the battered remnant of the order sailed out of the harbor in the first days of January 1523, bound first for Crete and in the end, years afterward, for Malta, they left behind a fortress that had beaten back every earlier sultan and a conqueror who had chosen this time to let them live. The two campaigns worked their effect upon the courts of Europe. The dispatches that made their way back west shed their earlier condescension and took on a colder, more urgent note. The Venetians and the Genoese were no longer describing a pliable youth who might be managed, but a sovereign who moved faster than his enemies could gather, and who in 2 short years had already begun to rival the dread reputation of his father. Within the Sultan's own household, meanwhile, the campaigns had settled something. Suleiman had come out of Belgrade and Rhodes not as a solitary figure, but as the fixed center of a partnership. Ibrahim had proved himself in the hard labor of war, in the management of the march, the keeping of counsel, the endless administration that turns a besieging army into an instrument that works. And the Sultan's regard for him was no longer merely a matter of the heart, it had become a political fact, one that the viziers and pashas of the divan would now be forced to reckon with, whether they welcomed it or not. The magnificence of the reign was being raised, season by season, more and more upon the shoulders of a single, extraordinary man. Belgrade had fallen, Rhodes had fallen. In 2 campaigning seasons, the prince the ambassadors had called mild had become the most feared name in Christendom. But the man who had ridden at his side through both sieges, who shared his tent and his table, and, the whisper already went, his mind as no servant in the empire's history ever had, was about to be lifted higher than any slave had ever risen under the House of Osman. Suleiman had found the conquests. Now he would raise up the friend. The boy had been born, by the tradition that comes down to us, near the town of Parga, a small port on the Ionian coast that then lay under the protection of the Venetian Republic. He was, that same tradition holds, the son of a sailor or a fisherman, a child of the salt and the shoreline, whose life would in the ordinary course have run its length within sight of the sea that fed his family. Then the raiders came. In the harsh and transactional world of the Mediterranean frontier, the seizing of children for the slave markets was a commonplace, one of the routine cruelties of the age. But for this particular child, the outcome would be anything but common. Carried off from his home and sold into the machinery of the Ottoman household, he was brought at last into the orbit of the young Prince Suleiman. By tradition, the two were close in age, and from their first acquaintance a bond took hold that would shape the next 13 years of the Sultan's life and, through him, the government of an empire. In the Ottoman state, the road to the highest power ran not through birth but through service. The empire had built in its palace schools an institution without parallel in Europe, the most promising of the enslaved and the levied, many of them, like Ibrahim, taken as boys from the Christian provinces and the frontier lands, were educated, trained, and raised up by merit into the administration and the army of the state. The Habsburg ambassador Buzbek, looking on a generation later, would record his astonishment that among the Ottomans high office went by worth rather than by ancestry, and that the Sultan's greatest men had so often begun as captives and herdsmen. In the House of Osman, he wrote, and there alone honor was the reward of ability. The mechanism behind that astonishment had a name. Through the levy the Ottomans called the devshirme, the state gathered up at intervals a portion of the boys of its Christian villages in the Balkans, converted them to Islam, and schooled the ablest of them for a lifetime of service as the Sultan's own slaves, his kuliyi, men bound to him alone, owing their every advancement to his favor rather than to any family or faction. It was from this class of the highly trained unfree, and not from any hereditary nobility, that the empire drew its generals, its governors, and its viziers. Ibrahim's own road into the household had run through capture and sale rather than the formal levy, but he belonged to that same world and rose by the same logic. Ibrahim was that principle carried to its dazzling extreme. He was quick, charming, and gifted with tongues, at ease in the languages of the court and of the wider Mediterranean. He was a musician and a reader of histories, and he possessed above all an intuitive gift for reading his master. He rose through the privy chamber to become the Sultan's most intimate body servant, and then something far greater. When Suleiman came to the throne in 1520, Ibrahim was already his constant companion, but within 3 years the Sultan's regard broke through the ordinary bounds of favor. In 1523 he raised Ibrahim to the office of Grand Vizier, the head of the whole imperial government, the second man in the empire, vaulting him over the grey heads of seasoned pashas and generals who had given decades to the state, and passing over the sitting vizier, who took the slight bitterly. Ibrahim was not yet 30. He was foreign-born, palace-raised, a former slave, and he now stood at the summit of the administration of the House of Osman. The capital watched in a kind of breathless disbelief. It was not merely a promotion, it was a wholesale transfer of trust, such as no servant of the dynasty had ever received. Suleiman did not keep his Grand Vizier at the ceremonial distance a sultan usually kept from his ministers. He brought him close. They dined together, often far into the night. The Sultan gave him a great palace on the edge of the Hippodrome, the ancient chariot ground at the heart of the city, a residence whose scale and splendor proclaimed the wealth flowing from the throne. He was given command of armies as Serasker commander-in-chief. He was made governor-general of Rumelia, the empire's European half, and his word in the council and in the audience chamber carried the authority of the Sultan himself. When Ibrahim treated with foreign ambassadors, they understood that they were, in effect, hearing Suleiman. About the year 1524, his marriage was celebrated with a magnificence that verged on the imperial, a festival of days on the Hippodrome that set the whole city talking. Venetian envoys, taking the measure of the court, reported home that the empire was in effect governed by 2 men, and that of the 2 it was frequently the vizier who was the more readily seen. The scope of what he was given to do was without precedent as well. When Egypt, the richest of the Sultan's new provinces, wrested from the Mamluks only a decade before so, was thrown into disorder by the revolt of its own governor, it was Ibrahim whom Suleiman sent south late in 1524 to set the province to rights. He spent the better part of a year in Cairo reordering its government, its revenues, and its garrisons, and left behind him a body of regulation that would frame the administration of Egypt for generations. It was the work of a viceroy rather than a minister, entrusted to a man not yet past his early 30s, and he returned with his standing higher than ever, confirmed in the Sultan's eyes as one who could be handed a kingdom and trusted to govern it. Consider what the office itself meant. The Grand Vizier was the absolute deputy of the Sultan, the bearer of the imperial seal, the head of the divan, the man through whom the vast correspondence of the empire passed and before whom its highest servants bowed. For that office to be held year upon year by the Sultan's dearest friend was to fuse the personal and the political into a single point, to make the government of the empire and the affection of its master into one and the same thing. It was an arrangement of enormous efficiency while it lasted, for the sovereign's will met no friction on its way into action. It was also an arrangement with no natural check upon it and no clear end, and the men at court who understood power understood too that such things do not resolve themselves quietly. For a time the partnership was an engine of remarkable power. Ibrahim became the instrument through which the Sultan's ordering will reached into the machinery of the state, the man who smoothed the administration, pressed forward the business of taxation and justice, and gave a sharper edge of competence to the government of a swelling empire. He was, to the world outside, the visible face of the magnificence that had begun to gather around Suleiman's name, and in exactly that visibility lay the danger. In the architecture of absolute power, there is no more perilous place to stand than nearest the throne, for the servant who rises highest has the farthest to fall, and every step upward is watched by those he has climbed above. The grander Ibrahim became, the more the older families and the passed-over men of the court murmured against him. They saw in his ascent an affront to the natural order, a disruption of the settled ways of the House of Osman. The opulence of his household, the reach of his authority, the sheer nearness of him to the sovereign, all of it, in the eyes of his rivals, was a provocation waiting to be answered. He was the Sultan's alter ego, his second self, his fortunes bound so tightly to Suleiman's own that the two seemed for a while inseparable. But the long history of the Ottoman court was littered with the wreckage of favorites who had forgotten a single, unforgiving truth, that the authority they wielded was alone and never a possession, and that it could be recalled without warning and without appeal. Suleiman, for his part, gave no public sign of unease. He heaped upon his friend office after office, mission after mission, and entrusted him with the most delicate business of the reign, the treating with Venice, the management of the western frontier, the diplomacy that framed the empire's dealings with the courts of Europe. It was Ibrahim who gave audience to the envoys of the Christian powers, meeting them in their own tongues so that foreign courts learned to address themselves to the Grand Vizier as the surest road to the Sultan's ear. The magnificence of the age was real, but it was a thing held together by a single will and lent to a single man, and its brilliance and its fragility were two faces of one coin. To love a servant so completely and to place in his hands so vast and unchecked an authority was to build a great part of the reign upon a bond of pure trust, and trust in the house of an absolute sovereign is the most breakable of all foundations. The court watched and waited and wondered when the reflection would be shattered. Yet for now the golden hour only lengthened. The borders of the empire were not walls but tides, forever pressing outward, and the Sultan was already turning his mind from the settled business of government to the oldest ambition of his house. Ibrahim would ride at his side into it, as he had ridden at Belgrade and at Rhodes, Grand Vizier, commander of the armies, the second self of the Sultan, carried forward on the great campaign that would make Suleiman the master of the Middle Danube. So the boy from Parga, taken in a raid and sold into a palace, now governed an empire second only to the Sultan who loved him, Grand Vizier, commander of the armies, the second self of Suleiman. It could not last, though no one living yet knew why or how suddenly. And it would not be a quarrel or a defeat that carried the two of them onward, but the oldest hunger of the House of Osman. The road into Hungary lay open at last, and at the end of it a young king waited with his knights on a wide and waterlogged plain called Mohács. The road to Hungary ran north from the conquered gate of Belgrade, and by the summer of 1526 the army that marched up it had been honed to a terrible perfection. It was a professional force of a size and sophistication that made the old feudal levies of Christendom look like relics of another age. A standing corps of disciplined infantry and cavalry, a great train of artillery, a commissariat that could feed a moving city. At its head rode Suleiman, his household about him, and with him Ibrahim Pasha, his grand vizier and closest confidant, who carried much of the immense logistical burden of the march. They were advancing into a kingdom that was, for all its proud history, a hollowed shell. Hungary had once been the strong Christian bulwark of the Middle Danube. Now it was a divided realm under a boy king, its great nobles more jealous of one another than fearful of the storm coming up the river. That king was Louis II of the House of Jagiellon, young, not yet 20, brave and desperately unlucky. His authority was undercut at every turn by magnates who guarded their own local power more carefully than they guarded the kingdom, and in the months before the invasion he sent appeal after appeal to the princes of Christendom for the men and the money he needed to survive. Little came. Europe was consumed by its own quarrels, the long duel of Habsburg and Valois, the widening breach of the Reformation, and so when the Sultan threw his bridges across the Danube and came on, Louis found himself facing the greatest empire of the age very nearly alone. The Hungarian War Council took a decision that historians have weighed and questioned ever since, to stake the whole future of the kingdom on a single-pitched battle, on the open, gently rolling plains south of the town of Mohács. It was a choice made partly of necessity and partly of a proud and fatal confidence. On the 29th of August, 1526, the two armies drew up their lines. The Hungarian host was built around the flower of the realm's heavy cavalry, armored knights whose forefathers had held that frontier for generations, formidable in the charge, but dangerously few. The Ottoman army facing them was a thing of depth and layered order, screens of light horse before a spine of Janissary infantry with their firearms, and behind and among them a great weight of artillery, many of the guns chained together in the Ottoman fashion to form a line that cavalry could not easily break. The numbers on that field cannot be fixed with any certainty. The chronicles on both sides exaggerate for glory or for grief. It is generally reckoned that the Hungarians brought something on the order of 25,000 to 30,000 men, and that the Ottoman army was substantially larger. Whatever the true figures, the disproportion of force and of method was decisive. The Hungarian command was itself divided and uncertain, its authority shared among quarreling leaders, its counsel loud and late. The chief conduct of the army had been given jointly to Paul Timuri, the warrior archbishop of Kalocsa, and to one of the great lay magnates of the realm, a churchman and a nobleman set together over a host that many of its own captains judged too weak to fight, and that took the field against the counsel of those who urged it to fall back and wait for the strength still gathering behind it. The army had been gathered in haste, and much of the kingdom's strength was still upon the roads. Transylvanian and Croatian forces marching toward a battle that would be lost before they could reach it. Suleiman, by contrast, directed a single instrument answering to a single will. He took his place upon a rise behind the Janissary line, where the guns were massed, and let the discipline of his army do what the courage of the Hungarian knights could not undo. Through the campaign, a terse daybook was kept in the Sultan's name, recording the rivers crossed, the reigns, and the councils held, so that the progress of the invasion can be followed almost from one day to the next. The battle opened in the late afternoon. The Hungarian knights, staking everything on the shock of a single charge, spurred forward against the Ottoman line, and for a moment the ground shook and the forward ranks gave way before them. But the Ottoman order was built to absorb exactly such a blow. As the charge drove in, the center yielded and drew the attackers deeper, onto the massed guns and the disciplined firearms of the Janissaries. The artillery opened and the assault lost its momentum, and then its cohesion, and then its shape. In something like an hour and a half, 2 hours at the most, the army of the Kingdom of Hungary was broken and destroyed. It was less a battle than the sudden collapse of one. The greater part of the Hungarian nobility fell on that plain, and with them a swathe of the kingdom's leaders, its commanders, the greater barons of the realm, and no fewer than 7 prelates of the Hungarian church, the archbishop commander Tomori among them. A realm was decapitated in an afternoon. As the rout spread, the young king turned his horse and fled the ruin of his army through the gathering dusk. He did not reach safety. Crossing a small stream swollen with the season's rain, tradition names it the Kile. His horse foundered on the marshy bank, and Louis II was thrown, and under the weight of his heavy armor he drowned in the water and the mud, in the dark, unseen by the men fleeing around him. He was 20 years old. His body was not recovered until weeks afterward, when the flood had fallen and searchers drew it from the mud of the marsh to be carried away at last for burial. With him died the Jagiellonian line in Hungary and the medieval kingdom that had guarded the Middle Danube for 500 years. In Hungary, the name of Mohács would never afterward be only the name of a place. It became the word for catastrophe itself, the measure against which every later disaster of the nation would be set, the afternoon on which a kingdom that had stood for half 1,000 years was unmade, and after which nothing was ever quite restored to what it had been. In the weeks after the battle, the Ottoman army moved north to Buda, the Hungarian capital, on its hill above the Danube. The city was occupied and much of it burned, and then, for the season was turning and the Sultan did not yet mean to hold the whole country, Suleiman turned his army back toward home, carrying off spoils and captives and leaving the shattered kingdom leaderless behind him. He had not come in 1526 to swallow Hungary outright. He had come to break it, and in that he had wholly succeeded. The permanent Ottoman occupation of the center of the country, with a Turkish governor seated in Buda, would come only later, in the grinding decades of Habsburg war that Mohács had set in motion. For the death of the king was the hinge on which everything turned. The crown of St. Stephen, stripped of its wearer, passed into dispute, and through the marriage ties of Louis's own family, the Habsburgs advanced their claim to it. For the dead king had been doubly bound to the House of Habsburg. He had married Mary, the sister of the Emperor Charles and of Ferdinand, and his own sister Anna had been given years before to Ferdinand himself, a double alliance sealed at Vienna, and now the legal ground on which Ferdinand pressed his claim to the widowed crown. Within months of the battle, the Sultan's client, John Zapolya, had himself crowned king with the recovered crown of St. Stephen. Within months more, Ferdinand was elected king by a rival party of nobles, so that one throne now bore two kings, and the long struggle for Hungary had found its shape. So Mohács, which destroyed one dynasty's kingdom, opened another's long contest for the wreckage. The struggle that followed would set the House of Osman against the House of Habsburg along the Danube for a century and more, and would carve Hungary into pieces, a western strip under the Habsburgs, the center falling in time under Ottoman rule, and the east held by the Sultan's client. Suleiman had come as a conqueror and had won as complete a victory as a commander could win. But he had also torn away the settled order of a whole frontier and set his empire the endless, grinding task of holding a borderland that could never be fully secured. Mohács has stood ever since as the day the medieval world of Central Europe was broken, the triumph of the disciplined, centralized gunpowder state over the older order of mounted chivalry and quarrelsome lords. For Suleiman it was the summit of his early reputation as a conqueror. He had shown that his reach was not bounded by the Levant or the East, that he could carry the war to the very threshold of the German lands, and the news of it was felt in every court in Europe, from Rome to Madrid, as the cold understanding settled that the frontier of Ottoman power had moved north and would not easily be pushed back. Yet folded within that magnificence was its familiar shadow. The victory that made him master of the Middle Danube also committed him to a war without visible end upon a frontier that would draw upon his armies and his treasury for as long as his house should reign. In something under 2 hours, the army of a kingdom had been destroyed, and its young king lay drowned in a flooded ditch beneath the weight of his own armor. The road into the heart of Europe was open now, running north and west toward a great city on the Danube that had never in its history seen a Turkish army beneath its walls. 3 years later, Suleiman would stand before Vienna in the driving autumn rain, at the very farthest edge of everything the House of Osman would ever hold, and there, for the first time in his life, the conqueror would learn the taste of a word he had never needed: enough. The quarrel over the Hungarian crown, opened on the field at Mohács, was never merely a local dispute of succession. It was the grinding of two great powers against each other along a single fault line. To the west lay the vast and scattered inheritance of the Habsburgs, the Emperor Charles V, whose dominions ringed half of Europe, and his brother Ferdinand, who ruled the Austrian lands and now pressed his own claim to the crown of Hungary, casting himself as the shield of a threatened Christendom. To the east stood the Ottoman Empire with its own universal claim, and the Sultan's chosen candidate for the Hungarian throne, John Zápolya, whom Suleiman held to be the lawful king and his rightful vassal. For a Habsburg to seize the frontier the Sultan had just conquered, and to cast down the Sultan's client, was a defiance that could not be suffered to stand. In 1529, Suleiman resolved to answer it at the source, to march not merely into Hungary but beyond it, against the seat of Ferdinand's power itself, the city of Vienna on the Danube. It would be the deepest thrust the House of Osman would ever make into the heart of Europe. The army that set out from Constantinople in the spring was immense, a moving nation of soldiers and horses and guns strung out for miles along the Balkan roads, but the season itself rose against it. The year 1529 brought one of the wettest of summers, week upon week of relentless rain that turned the tracks of the Danube basin into a wilderness of mud. The heavy siege cannon, the great battering pieces that were the pride of the Ottoman arsenal and the true key to reducing a walled city, were the first casualties of the weather. Mired to their axles, they could not be dragged forward at the army's pace, and many of the largest were abandoned on the road. It was a loss whose full cost would only be counted at the walls, and it owed nothing to any failure of will. The sky, and not the enemy, had begun to disarm the siege before it ever came in sight of its object. The march itself devoured the better part of the year. The host had left the capital in the middle of May. It was September before it had come up through Hungary, set Suleiman's client Zápolya once more in Buda, and pressed on to the west. By the time the imperial tents rose before Vienna, near the end of that month, the calendar had already become the Sultan's most dangerous adversary. The great enterprise had reached its goal with the campaigning season all but spent. The city that waited for him was frightened and bracing for the worst, but it was not defenseless. Its walls were old, and there had been only weeks in which to strengthen them, yet its garrison held together with discipline. The defense had been given to Niklas Graf Salm, a soldier already near 70, with Wilhelm von Roggendorf beside him, and under them stood some 16,000 to 20,000 men in all German and Spanish professional infantry, Austrian levies, and companies of mercenary pikemen, a small force against the host, now spreading across the plain but hardened and well led. Ferdinand himself was not within the walls. He had withdrawn to the north to raise what troops he could from Bohemia and the Empire, and left his capital to his commanders. In the days before the Sultan's arrival, the defenders had burned the suburbs outside the walls, denying the besiegers cover and shelter, and had thrown up earthworks behind the aging medieval circuit. And ahead of the main Ottoman army, the light horsemen of the frontier, the Akıncı, had swept through Lower Austria, burning the villages and carrying off captives almost to the outskirts of the city, so that Vienna stood ringed by a wasted and half-emptied country before ever the first siege line was drawn. It was a modest force by the measure of the host now spreading across the plain before it. From the ramparts the defenders looked out upon a sea of tents and standards that proclaimed the presence of the most powerful sovereign on earth here, but it was resolute, and it was well led. For the men on the walls the siege was a matter of survival. For Suleiman it was the farthest reach of a career that had known until this hour only the widening of frontiers. The siege took the form such sieges took in that age, a slow, patient, subterranean violence. Deprived of his heaviest guns, the Sultan leaned upon his miners, who dug beneath the foundations of the walls, to pack them with powder and bring them down from below. And the defenders labored to hear the digging, sinking countermines, breaking into the enemy's tunnels, fighting for them in the dark before the charges could be lit. To catch the diggers before their work was done, the garrison sank bowls of water and set drums strung with dried peas upon the ground, and watched for the trembling in the water and the grains that betrayed the tunneling below. Where a mine brought down a length of wall, the assault came on across the rubble, and the garrison met it in the breach and threw it back. In the middle of October, the besiegers made their greatest efforts, storming the broken sections in force on successive days, the last and fiercest of them on the 14th. Each time the defenders held the gap, and each time the attackers fell back from it. The walls were scarred and broken in places, but they were not carried, and the city did not yield. Within the walls the defenders gave as good as they got. They mounted sorties from the gates to fall upon the sappers and collapse their galleries, drove the besiegers back from the breaches, and fought in the rubble with a stubbornness that their modest numbers could not by themselves explain. Word of the Ottoman host had run ahead across Europe and emptied the countryside before it. But here, behind the battered circuit of one city, a few thousand resolute men were spending, week by week, the Sultan's most precious and least recoverable resource, time. For all the months the long march had consumed, the siege itself would last barely 3 weeks. The campaign had all but exhausted its strength merely in coming to the walls. For the Ottomans, so long accustomed to the swift reduction of fortresses, the stubbornness of this one was both a novelty and a frustration. The empire's whole method of war was built upon overwhelming force patiently applied, and that method at Vienna had been quietly undone by two things it could not overwhelm: the weather that had swallowed the siege train, and the clock that governs every army in the field. The Habsburgs, for their part, had staked the defense of the whole German south upon this single wall. Had Vienna fallen, the road up the Danube toward the imperial heartland would have lain open, and the shock of it would have run through every court in Europe. That it did not fall was owed as much to the mud and the calendar as to the courage of the men in the breaches, but hold it did. The old commander who had held it did not long outlive his victory. Struck by splintered stone in the fighting on the walls, Salm carried the hurt away with him when the siege was raised, and died of it the following spring. And all the while a second enemy was closing upon the besiegers, one that no assault could drive off. The nights were lengthening and turning bitterly cold, the autumn was far gone, the long supply lines that fed the army were stretched to breaking, and the season on which every such campaign depended was very nearly over. The host that had crossed the Balkans in the warmth of summer now faced the prospect of wintering in a hostile country before an unbroken wall, and even the Janissaries, the hardest and most reliable soldiers in the empire, had little stomach for it. Suleiman, who governed by the cold arithmetic of statecraft, could read the reckoning as clearly as any commander alive. He had carried the strength of his empire to the very doorstep of the Habsburg lands, and shown that he could strike at Ferdinand's own capital whenever he chose. But the city had held, his great guns were far behind him in the mud, and the year was gone. The withdrawal, when he ordered it, proved a hard passage in its own right. The army turned homeward into worsening weather, and the first cold harried at the river crossings and shedding much of its baggage and many of its prisoners along the way, so that the retreat cost the host more than the storming of the breaches ever had. Here, before these walls, the outward surge of the rain reached its limit. It was not a rout and not a catastrophe. The army would come away intact, and the Sultan's prestige, in the language of the age, undimmed. But it was a boundary and a permanent one, the high water mark of Ottoman power in the west. The tide that had risen through Belgrade and through Mohács struck the rock of Vienna, and in all the reigns that followed, would never rise past it again. And there was a deeper turn folded into that cold autumn, one that no chronicle of the campaign could see. For all the magnitude of the thing, the greatest army in the world, the deepest march it would ever make, the most consequential struggle of Suleiman's life was not being waged on the Danube at all. It was being waged quietly and without a single soldier under arms, inside the walls of his own palace, and its outcome would shape the House of Osman far longer than the fate of any city on the frontier. The rains came early that year, the great guns sank in the mud and were left behind, and in the middle of October, Suleiman turned his enormous army around and went home. Vienna had held, and the tide of Ottoman Europe had reached its mark and would never rise past it again. He had conquered more than any sultan before him. But the most consequential conquest of his entire life had already been made, and not by his armies. Inside the walls of his own palace, a captured girl with a famous laugh had taken the heart of the master of the world, and she had no intention of ever giving it back. The imperial household was an institution of cold and deliberate order, built above all to secure the succession and the survival of the dynasty. For generations, the custom of the House of Osman had held to a rigid design. A concubine of the harem might bear the Sultan a son, but she was to bear him only one, and when that prince came of age, he was sent out to govern a distant province and learn the arts of rule, and his mother went with him as to preside over his household, to guard and guide him, and to leave the capital and the Sultan behind. She became a mother and never a wife. The logic was ruthless and effective. By binding each mother to a single son and sending both away, the system denied any one woman a permanent place at the center of power, and so guarded the dynasty against the intrigues that a favorite might otherwise breed. It had held for as long as the empire had stood. The man who reigned now would set it aside, and the woman who entered his life would prove the exception that broke the ancient rule. At the summit of that household stood not a wife, but a mother. The supreme authority within the harem belonged to the valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning Sultan, who governed the women's establishment and whose influence reached well beyond it, into the councils of the throne itself. In the early years of this reign, that place was held by Suleiman's own mother, Hafsa Sultan, who presided over the household until her death in 1534, after which the office stood empty and no woman of the palace ranked above the Sultan's favorite. Below the valide, the order descended strict and unbending through the mothers of princes and the senior stewardesses of the household. Nor was the harem only a nursery of heirs. It was a school and, in its way, an instrument of state. The girls brought into it were trained in letters, in music, and in the management of a great household, and the ablest among them were in time freed and married to the rising men of the government, so that the women's quarters bound the Sultan's servants to the throne by ties of family as well as of service. This was the settled order that Hürrem would remake around herself. She came, as so many did, through the machinery of the frontier. She was of Ruthenian origin, born in the opening years of the 16th century, by later tradition at Rohatin, in what is now western Ukraine. That same tradition, which traces to a Polish poem written a full century after her birth, would make her the daughter of an Orthodox priest, carried off in a Tatar slave raid. But the detail belongs to the amber of legend rather than to the hard ledger of the record, and the truth of her childhood cannot now be recovered. What can be said is that she was taken into the vast slave trade that fed the households of the empire, carried through the markets of the Crimea, and brought at last to Constantinople and into the imperial harem. She was young and quick, and the Ottomans named her Hürrem, the joyful one, the laughing one. To the Europeans, who thought of her homeland by the old name of Roxelana, she would always be Roxelana. In the imagination of the West, she would become, in time, a figure of dark legend, the scheming Roxelana who poisoned the court and murdered her way to power. But that portrait is very largely the invention of later ages and of hostile pens, and it must be set aside at the outset. What the record actually preserves is a woman of formidable intelligence and of a devotion on both sides that is documented beyond dispute. She did not merely survive the harem, that school, that hierarchy, that power center of the imperial household. She rose through it to take the whole and undivided attention of the Sultan. Suleiman, the grave lawgiver, the conqueror, the poet who wrote under the name Muhibi, the lover, found in her a companion who broke through the great isolation of his office. In his verse, he addressed her with a tenderness he showed to no one else. In the lyric that is best known, in the English rendering that has carried it down the centuries, he calls her the throne of his lonely niche, his wealth, his love, his moonlight, his most sincere friend, his confidant, his very existence. The words reach us through translation, not from his own hand in our language, and they were the words of a private man and not of a sovereign's proclamation, which is precisely their weight, and the devotion was not his alone. Hürrem's own letters to the Sultan survive, sent to him on his long campaigns, effusive, intimate, thick with longing and with prayers for his safety and his health, some of them dictated to palace scribes. Between the poems and the letters, we are left with something rare in the record of any throne, the plain evidence of a marriage of real feeling at the heart of a great empire. Her presence in the palace worked a quiet revolution. She bore Suleiman several children, among them Mehmed, the daughter Mihrimah, his only daughter to live to womanhood, Selim, Bayezid, and the youngest, the frail Cihangir. By the old custom, she should long since have been sent away, dispatched to some provincial court as the mother of a single prince. Instead, she remained at the Sultan's side in the capital year upon year, and as she remained, the ancient boundaries of the household began to dissolve around her. The harem, once a place of ritual distance and rotation, became the fixed center of the Sultan's private world. This, of necessity, opened a fault line through the house. Before Hürrem's rise, the foremost woman of the palace had been Mahidevran, the mother of Suleiman's eldest son, Shehzade Mustafa. Mustafa was a prince of great promise, admired in the army, a young man who seemed to carry in himself the martial virtues of the House of Osman. For Mahidevran, the ascent of Hürrem was no ordinary matter of jealousy, it was an existential threat. She had followed the rules of the dynasty. She was the mother of the heir the empire expected, To watch the Sultan's affection and with it his favor settle year by year upon another woman was to watch her own son's future narrow toward a vanishing point. The rivalry between the two women, and between the lines of sons behind them, became the deep and silent pressure within the walls of Topkapi, a tension the Sultan could neither dissolve nor, in the end, escape. Foreign ambassadors, ever eager to find a weakness in the Ottoman armor, began to report on the Sultan's attachment, framing his devotion as a sign of softness or the triumph of a woman's cunning. They mistook the matter entirely. Suleiman's decision to keep Hürrem beside him was not a distraction from his rule, but an extension of it, an act of deliberate and sovereign will. He was rewriting the private law of his own house with the same boldness he brought to the public law of his empire, and he did not much care what Venice or Vienna made of it. Then, in the mid-1530s, he moved toward a step without precedent in the living memory of his house. First, he freed her, most likely in the year 1533, formally lifting Hürrem from the status of slave to that of a free woman, an act whose only visible purpose was to clear the ground for what he intended next. The custom of the dynasty had rested for generations upon concubinage, precisely so that no wife should ever stand at the summit of the household, and everyone at court could see now that the Sultan was preparing to overturn it. She would go on, in the years that followed, to hold a place no woman of the imperial household had held before her. For her, a new rank was named Haseki Sultan, the title of the Sultan's chief consort, coined to fit a woman for whom the old vocabulary of the harem had no word. She endowed great charitable foundations under her own name. In the capital, a whole complex raised by the imperial architect Sinan, a mosque, a college, a school for children, a hospital, and a public kitchen for the poor, and works of piety that reached as far as the holy cities. Among them, a great soup kitchen at Jerusalem that would feed the poor and the pilgrim for centuries after her death. Her hand reached into the business of the state as well. Letters survive in which she wrote in her own name to the King of Poland, Sigismund Augustus, in the language of friendship between the two realms, a consort of the House of Osman, corresponding directly with a Christian monarch beyond the frontier. And she stood at the beginning of the age that a later time would name the Sultanate of Women. Here the line must be drawn, and drawn plainly. What the record shows is a woman of intelligence, agency, and dignity, loved by the Sultan, and loving him in return, who rose further than any slave of the house had ever risen. What the record does not show, whatever the later legends would claim, is the poisoner of the popular imagination. The two must never be confused. And yet the very success of her rise had set something in motion that no one in the palace could yet follow to its end. For in binding the Sultan's heart to herself and to her sons, she had, without a single blow, begun to unmake the future of Mahidevran's line, and the child of that line was the prince the whole empire had been raised to expect upon the throne. He freed her, and then he did the thing no Sultan had done in living memory. He married her, a former slave, before the law and the whole court, and made her his queen. Constantinople did not know what to make of it. The ambassadors wrote home in frank astonishment, and in the women's quarters the mother of the Sultan's eldest son watched her own future and her son's quietly narrow. But that was still a private matter, a thing of the household and the heart. The world outside saw only the summit of an age, the law, the mosque, the poem, the golden hour of the House of Osman. And it is to that magnificence we now turn, before the shadow inside the house grew long enough to reach it. The name that history outside the Ottoman world bestowed upon him, the Magnificent, was a title born of awe, an attempt by Western observers to fix in a single word the sheer weight of his presence. But in the lands he ruled, among the people who lived beneath the shade of his banner, he was remembered by a different name, one that spoke not of splendor but of the bedrock of the state. They called him Kanunî, the Lawgiver. It was a name earned through a long and patient labor of governance that ran quietly beneath the noise of the campaigns, and it may in the end have proved the more lasting of his two great works. While his armies redrew the map of 3 continents, Suleiman turned the same ordering mind upon the empire itself, binding a sprawling multi-confessional realm into a single coherent system of justice. The Ottoman world he governed was a patchwork of ancient usages, the sacred law of Islam, the Sharia, eternal and God-given, and beside it a great tangle of local custom, provincial precedent, and the accumulated decrees of earlier sultans. Over these Suleiman presided over the systematic codification of the Kanun, the secular or sultanic law that stood alongside the religious code rather than against it. This was the labor of decades, not of a single season. Its purpose was to make the empire legible to itself, to fix how land was held and taxed, how the Timar estates that furnished the cavalry were granted and passed on, how markets and coinage were regulated, how crimes were weighed and answered. Where older practice had leaned on mutilation and death, the Sultanic code turned increasingly toward fixed fines and graded penalties, and it set limits on what the powerful might exact from the riaya, the tax-paying subjects whose labor sustained the whole. The signal achievement of the reign was to reconcile this body of worldly regulation with the Sharia, a delicate task carried through above all by the eminent jurist Ebu Suud Effendi, whom Suleiman raised to the high office of Shaykhul Islam and who labored to frame the Sultan's law so that it sat in harmony with the religious law rather than in defiance of it. At the base of that system lay the land itself. Most of the empire's soil was miribai, held in the name of the state rather than owned outright, and much of it was parceled into timars, grants not of property but of the right to gather a district's taxes bestowed upon a sipahi, a mounted warrior who in return answered the Sultan's summons to war with his horse, his arms, and armed retainers of his own. From time to time, the Sultan's officials moved through the provinces compiling the great cadastral registers, the Tahrir Defterleri, counting households and fields and mills so that the burden of taxation might be fixed and known rather than wrung out at a governor's whim. The reconciling of this worldly regime of state-held land with a sacred law that had never imagined such a thing was, in its turn, among the most delicate of the labors that fell to Ebu Suud. He was not, and never claimed to be, the sole author of every clause. The genius of the settlement lay in its coherence and its endurance, a framework so durable that it would carry the Ottoman state for generations, holding the machinery of taxation and justice steady even when the throne was later occupied by far lesser men. In the bazaars of Istanbul and the distant provinces of the Balkans, in Anatolian villages and the newly conquered cities of the Arab lands, the Sultan sought to make the same shadow of law fall upon all, a merchant of Ragusa, a scholar of Baghdad, a farmer of the plateau, each to know exactly where he stood. It was a sovereign's understanding that the longevity of an empire rested not on the brilliance of its conquests, but on the fairness and the predictability of its courts. This is what the Turkish world remembers when it calls him not the Magnificent, but the Lawgiver. This spirit of order and construction found its most enduring expression in stone. Working through the middle of the century alongside Mimar Sinan, the former military engineer whom he had raised to be chief architect of the empire, Suleiman transformed the skyline of his capital into a testament to the age. The Süleymaniye, rising on the third hill of Istanbul between 1550 and 1557, was far more than a mosque. Sinan conceived it as a kulliye, a whole civic order gathered about the house of prayer, colleges of law and theology, a school of medicine and a hospital, a hospice that fed the poor without charge, a caravanserai, baths, a primary school, and rows of shops whose rents sustained it all. It was, in effect, a small city given form, its vast dome poised above the water in a balance so assured that the building seemed less constructed than resolved. In the precise miniatures of the court workshops it appears again and again, not as an object of pride only, but as the very emblem of the Sultan's self-appointed office, the protector under whose care the material and spiritual welfare of his people alike were gathered. Sinan would live to raise hundreds of structures across the empire and to name his own supreme masterwork elsewhere, at Edirne, in a later reign, but the Süleymaniye remains the monument that the Golden Age built to itself. Sinan himself had come to the Sultan's service by the same devshirme that drew so many of the empire's servants out of the Christian villages of the Balkans, and he had learned his craft not in a studio but in the army, throwing bridges across rivers on campaign before ever he raised a dome. His 4 minarets and their 10 balconies on the Süleymaniye were read by later ages as a quiet arithmetic of pride that Suleiman was the 4th Sultan to reign in the conquered city and the 10th of his line, though whether the builders ever intended the conceit cannot now be said. And he bent the same engineering to humbler and greater ends than domes, rebuilding the aqueducts and conduits that carried fresh water down from the hills into a capital which had by then swollen into the largest city in Europe. Yet for all his concern with the machinery of the state and the permanence of marble, there was an intimate dimension to the man that seldom surfaced in the official chronicles. The sovereign who signed his decrees with the iron authority of a world conqueror also lived in a world of rhythm and rhyme. Under the pen name Muhibbi, the lover, the affectionate friend, Suleiman composed a vast body of verse, one of the largest poetic corpuses any sovereign has ever left behind, and among the most revealing. In the Divana Muhibbi he wrote in the voice not of a ruler but of a longing man. His best-known lyric, addressed to Hürrem, survives in a widely circulated English rendering, and it must be heard as a translation, not as his literal words, that opens, "Throne of my lonely niche, my wealth, my love, my moonlight, my most sincere friend, my confidant, my very existence." These are not the cadences of a remote despot. They are the lines of a man who reached out from behind the gilded screen of the Sultanate to speak of solitude, of devotion, and of the swift passing of all earthly things. The public voice and the private one were two faces of a single magnificence. When his engineers cut an inscription into the fortress of Bender in 1538, it proclaimed his reach in language almost cosmic in its confidence. "I am God's slave and Sultan of this world. By the grace of God, I am the head of the community of Muhammad." It ran on through his titles: Shah in Baghdad, Caesar in the lands of Rome, Sultan in Egypt, the sovereign in whose name the Friday prayer was spoken in Mecca and Medina. It was the voice of universal sovereignty, of a man who understood himself as the hinge between heaven and earth, and the very hand that stood behind those words returned, in private, to write of yearning and impermanence and the vanity of the same glory it commanded. The culture of his court answered to both voices at once. It was a golden age in the fullest sense, an age in which the patronage of the Sultan drew the finest talents of 3 continents to Istanbul and set them to work. In the imperial ateliers, the Nakashane, painters and calligraphers and gilders produced illustrated chronicles of astonishing richness, the Suleimaname above all, which set down the deeds of the reign in color and gold, and the topographic miniatures of Matrakçı Nasu, who mapped the campaign cities of the empire with a clear and patient eye. The kilns of Iznik, quickened by the demand of the court, brought the glazed tile to a brilliance never afterwards surpassed. Cobalt and turquoise, and in just these years, a vivid new sealing wax red, and spread it in panels of flowers across the walls of the imperial mosques, and masters of the pen such as Ahmed Karahisari raised Ottoman calligraphy to a monumental grandeur fit to carry the word of God around the base of a dome. Poetry flourished, and music, and the sciences of the day. The calligraphers refined the Sultan's very decrees into objects of beauty. The whole of it radiated a single conviction, that this was the summit of the civilized world, and that it had been reached in his name. Everything about the reign seemed built to endure 1,000 years. The laws were written down, the mosques were raised, the verses were copied and preserved, the frontiers hardened against every enemy. There was, in these middle years, a sense of near completion, as though the Sultan had at last fashioned the world into the shape he intended it to keep. He held the power and the law and the arts, and he had beside him the one person he loved most in all the world. It was a height from which the view seemed to run on without end, a moment of such concentrated and dazzling excellence that it might have gone on unfolding forever, in cycles of perfect order and grace. This was the height of it, the Kanunî, the lawgiver, sovereign of a civilization at the very top of its powers, a conqueror who was also a poet, and who signed his verses not Sultan but Muhibbi, the lover. It is the Suleiman the golden legend remembers, and in this the legend does not lie. But golden ages keep their darkness close beside them, and the first blow of the reign's long tragedy was about to fall. Not on an enemy, not on a rebel, but on the one person in the world the Sultan loved best. In the spring of 1536, in a room inside his own palace, the lawgiver would break his own given word. The campaign against the Safavids had been a triumph of logistics and of sheer grinding power. Suleiman had moved his armies across the rugged spine of the Zagros, through snow-choked passes and onto the high Persian plateau, in the long war that the Ottomans remembered as the campaign of the 2 Iraqs. Ibrahim Pasha rode at the head of it as Serasker, commander-in-chief, sent ahead with the full confidence of a sultan who trusted him beyond any other man alive. By the close of 1534, the vanguard had entered Tabriz, and soon after the imperial banners were raised over the ancient walls of Baghdad, the city of the caliphs. It was a conquest that fastened the Ottoman hold upon Mesopotamia, secured the eastern flank of the empire, and added to Suleiman's titles the guardianship of some of the holiest ground of Islam. Ibrahim returned toward Constantinople not merely as a vizier but as a conqueror in his own right, a man who had acted as the Sultan's very shadow across the battlefields of the East. He stood at the absolute zenith of his power. He was the architect of the empire's foreign policy and the negotiator of its most delicate treaties. The envoys of kings had learned to seek him out, and his seal upon an accord carried the authority of the Sultan himself. He kept a palace on the hippodrome that rivaled his master's own, and by every account that survives, he remained the only man in the world who could speak to Suleiman as something near an equal. The office Ibrahim held was the most powerful that any subject of the Sultan could occupy. The Grand Vizier was the sovereign's absolute deputy, keeper of the imperial seal, and president of the Divan-e Humayun, the imperial council that was, in effect, the government of the empire, and he could be sent out as Serasker to command the Sultan's armies in the Sultan's own place. Into Ibrahim's hands had been gathered honors seldom combined in any one man: the vizierate, the governor-generalship of Rumelia, the whole European command of the empire. It was he who received the envoys of foreign crowns, who treated with the Habsburgs over the fate of Hungary, and drew the first threads of the alignment with distant France, so that to the watching chancelleries of Europe he seemed at times less the Sultan's minister than his co-ruler. Yet the office rested upon a foundation that was also its abyss. Like nearly all the great servants of the state, the Grand Vizier was in law the Sultan's kul, his slave, raised out of bondage and owing everything, his office and his wealth and his very life, to the master who had made him. Whatever such a man gathered to himself, he held only at his master's pleasure, and at a single word it could all be taken back again. Yet in the rarefied air at the summit of an empire, the view is perilous and the footing thin. The very intimacy that had once been the Sultan's comfort began, by slow and imperceptible degrees, to harden into a structural hazard. The court at Constantinople was a place of shifting alliances and deep, quiet resentments, and Ibrahim's rise, from an enslaved boy to the second man in a global power, vaulted in 1523 over the heads of viziers who had grown grey in the Sultan's service, had always been an affront to those of older blood and longer lineage. His staggering wealth only widened the breach. He moved with a grandeur that mirrored the Sultan's own, and there were those who murmured that his self-assurance had swollen into something dangerous. It was said that he had begun to let the word Sultan attach itself to his own style and titles, an assumption of dignity that was not his to claim. It was said, too, that on the Eastern campaign he had acted with a freedom that raised questions about where his ultimate loyalty lay. There had been a bitter quarrel in the East with Iskender Çelebi, the Defterdar who held the empire's purse, a powerful man whom Ibrahim accused, brought down, and saw put to death, a killing that many at court judged unjust, and one that laid bare how, as Serasker far from the Sultan's eye, the Grand Vizier had come to wield a power over life and death that belonged properly to the throne alone, and tradition holds that the treasurer's dying words accused the Grand Vizier in turn, and that the accusation was not forgotten. It is here that the historical record thins into a labyrinth of shadows, and honesty requires that we do not pretend to see through it. We cannot say with any certainty what finally tipped the scale. Was it the cooling of a friendship that had run its long and exhausting course? Was it the patient pressure of a rival faction gathering at court, the interest of Hürrem and of her son-in-law, the rising Rustem, for whom so mighty a Grand Vizier could only be an obstacle? Was it the cold, sovereign conviction, older than either of them, that no servant, however gifted or however loved, may ever be permitted to grow large enough to shadow the throne itself? The chronicles and the later traditions are crowded with accusations, this rival named or that conspiracy alleged, but many of these are the stories told afterward by the people who survive to tell them, and they name motives the sources cannot prove. What remains documented is the result, not the reason. The Sultan, who had shared his table and his secrets and his life with Ibrahim for 13 years, determined, at the last, that the bond had to be severed. The end came in the darkness between the 14th and the 15th of March, 1536. It was the holy month of Ramadan, the season of fasting by day and prayer by night, and the Sultan had bidden Ibrahim break the fast with him within the private quarters of the Topkapi Palace, a gesture that to any observer looked like the renewal of their old and famous closeness. They ate together and they talked as they had for 13 years. But when the night deepened and the palace fell still, on the Sultan's order and by the hands of the palace mutes, Ibrahim Pasha, the man who had been his brother in everything but blood, was strangled in that place and did not leave it alive. There is a persistent, later legend that the deed had first to wait upon a religious ruling, a fatwa contrived so that the Sultan might lawfully kill his friend while he slept. But this is the embroidery of a later age, a story fitted afterward to a reality that had needed no such justification. In that palace, on that night, the Sultan's word was itself the law. When the sun rose, the most powerful vizier in the history of the House of Osman was simply gone. There was no proclamation of treason, no trial, no charge read out for the empire to weigh. His vast accumulated wealth, the gold, the estates, the works of art, the palace on the hippodrome, was confiscated whole and drawn back into the imperial treasury as though it had never been his at all. It was the working of the same iron principle by which he had risen, the servant's estate reverting at his fall to the master who had only ever lent it, the reversion that Ottoman practice knew by the name of musadere. And the man who had kept a palace to rival his sovereigns was struck from the rolls of the great as wholly as from the ranks of the living. And Suleiman offered no explanation. He did not justify himself to the court, to the army, or to any foreign envoy. He appointed a successor and turned back to the business of the empire, as if the vacancy at the head of his government were a matter of administrative routine rather than the destruction of the one friendship of his life. For the court, the whole meaning was written in the silence. It was a lesson in the nature of absolute power that left a permanent chill along the corridors of Topkapi. The pashas and the scribes, the courtiers and the administrators, all of them understood what they had witnessed, that however high a man might climb, the summit itself was the most dangerous ground in the empire, that no intimacy was a shield and no record of loyal service any guarantee. It was the reign's first great self-inflicted wound, the moment when the Sultan's magnificence turned inward to consume the thing he had held most dear, and it set a dark and unforgotten precedent for the House of Osman. The court remembered it. They watched their step and guarded their tongues and waited for the next shift in the wind. And they would remember it still 17 years on, when the man strangled by the Sultan's order was not a friend, but a son. The empire itself did not pause. It had been built to be larger than any single man, and the machinery of its expansion was already locked in motion, indifferent to the private tragedies of its masters. The death of the Grand Vizier stopped neither the fleets nor the armies on the frontiers. The void he left was filled, the gears were oiled, and the great outward press of the Sultanate went on. And even as the earth was smoothed over the unmarked grave, a new power was already stirring on the water, out beyond the harbors of the capital, in the coves and channels of the Middle Sea, where the next and most astonishing chapter of the empire's ascent was even then being prepared, far from the quiet and grieving corridors of the palace. In the morning they carried the body of Ibrahim Pasha out of the palace and buried it without a stone to mark the place, and 13 years of a friendship that had governed an empire ended in complete silence. Suleiman never explained himself, not then, not once, not to anyone. The court took from it a lesson it would never afterward forget, that no love and no nearness was any protection against the will of the Sultan. And the empire, seeming untroubled, rolled straight on to new triumphs cut. For even as the Grand Vizier went down into his unmarked grave, a red-bearded Corsair out of the Aegean was in the act of turning the whole Mediterranean into an Ottoman lake. The horizon of the Ottoman world had always been defined by the march of the infantry and the thunder of the siege guns. Yet even as the Sultan's armies pushed into the heart of Europe and deep into the deserts of the East, a different kind of power was rising along the jagged, sun-bleached coasts of the Mediterranean, a power born not in the disciplined barracks of the Janissaries but in the salt spray, the hidden coves, and the desperate, high-stakes commerce of the Corsairs. At its center stood a man of singular ambition and unmatched instinct for the sea, Hayreddin, whom the Christians called Barbarossa, the Redbeard. Born on the Aegean island of Lesbos, he had passed from mariner to raider to warlord in the company of his elder brother Oruç, who had carved out a Corsair principality at Algiers on the Barbary coast. When Oruç fell in battle against the Spanish, Hayreddin inherited both the city and the struggle, and shrewder than his brother, he did what no mere pirate would have thought to do. He offered Algiers to the Sultan in Constantinople, receiving in return the rank of governor and the protection of the House of Osman. Algiers became the beating heart of a North African resistance against the encroaching reach of the Spanish Habsburgs and Hayreddin its master. To understand the man is to understand the sea that made him. The Mediterranean of those years was a sea of small and constant war, the guerre de course, a ceaseless traffic of raid and reprisal in which swift galleys swept down upon coastal villages and merchant hulls to carry off cargo and captives, the captives to be ransomed if they were worth a ransom and sold if they were not. It was no Ottoman monopoly. The Knights of Malta and the Corsairs of the Christian ports plied the same hard trade in the opposite direction, and the shores of Italy and Spain and North Africa alike learned to dread a strange sail on the horizon. It was out of this school, and not out of any prince's academy, that men like the brothers of Lesbos had first risen. To the Christian powers of the Middle Sea he was a scourge, a Corsair chieftain whose galleys struck without warning and vanished into the blue. To the Ottoman court, however, he represented something far more valuable, the key to an empire that need not end at the water's edge. In 1533, Suleiman summoned him to the capital, and when he came, the Sultan did not merely engage a mercenary, he formalized a change in the very nature of his sovereignty. Hayreddin was made Capudan Pasha, Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, and set to work at the great imperial arsenal on the Golden Horn, where the Sultan's treasure was poured into timber and rope and bronze. It was an admission that the House of Osman could no longer remain a purely land-bound power if it meant to hold the Mediterranean against the combined might of the papacy, of Venice, and of the Holy Roman Emperor. At that arsenal on the Golden Horn, the Tersani Amir, its ranks of vaulted boat houses climbing the water's edge, the Sultan's shipwrights labored through the winters to turn out the long, low war galleys, the kadırga, that were the very currency of Mediterranean power. Each was driven by banks of oars, pulled by rowers slave and free, and each carried a fighting complement of soldiers, for a battle at sea in that age was settled less by gunnery than by grappling and boarding, a land battle waged upon heaving decks. To this yard Barbarossa brought not only his own hardened captains, but a lifetime's intimate knowledge of the enemy's every coast and current. The sea was a theater of war entirely its own. There, the rigid logistics of a land campaign dissolved into shifting currents, contrary winds, and the sudden violent embrace of galleys locked oar to oar. The Emperor Charles V, who held himself the heir of Rome, regarded the Mediterranean as a Christian lake, an artery of trade and faith from which the infidel must be driven, and he commanded the resources of a global monarchy, the deep credit of the bankers of Genoa and Augsburg, and the service of the most celebrated seaman of the age, the Genoese admiral Andrea Doria. Between Sultan and Emperor, the struggle for the inner sea became a contest of reach and endurance that ran from the Straits of Gibraltar to the shores of the Levant. Its fortunes swung hard. In 1534, Barbarossa swept up the Italian coast, falling upon the shores of Calabria and Campania almost within sight of Naples, before turning south to drive the Hafsid ruler Mulay Hassan from Tunis and seize the city, planting Ottoman power astride the narrows that divide the Western Sea from the Eastern. It was more than the emperor could suffer. The following year Charles came in person, with a great armada and the flower of Spain and Italy, stormed the fortress of La Goleta that guarded the harbor, took Tunis back, and set his client once more upon its throne. The war was real, and it was very far from decided. Suleiman grasped that his reign would be measured, in part, by this conflict, and he backed his admiral with the full weight of the imperial treasury. The result was a navy that did not merely challenge the balance of power at sea but overturned it. Ottoman warships became a constant, looming presence, their lateen sails a familiar sight from the coasts of Italy to the harbors of Provence. The Sultan's alignment with Francis I of France, a marriage of convenience between the Ottoman throne and the French crown against their shared Habsburg enemy, extended his reach still further, and in time the Ottoman fleet would even winter at Toulon on the French coast, projecting power deep into the western basin. That entente was sealed not in arms alone but in privilege. For about 1536 the Sultan granted the French the capitulations, the rights of trade and residence within his dominions that made France the favored Christian power in the Levant, and knotted the two crowns the more tightly against Vienna and Madrid. It was an audacity that sent a shock through every chancellery of Europe, revealing an empire that was not merely a menace on the frontier but a full participant at the highest tables of continental diplomacy. The decisive test of this new ascendancy came in the late summer of 1538. The Christian powers, alarmed at the relentless expansion of Ottoman sea power, gathered a holy league, the papacy, Venice, the emperor, and Genoa, and with it a great fleet, by most counts considerably larger than the Sultan's, carrying thousands of soldiers and sailors under the cautious, experienced command of Andrea Doria. They sought out the Ottoman fleet, smaller and led by Barbarossa, in the waters off Preveza on the western coast of Greece, where the Gulf of Ambracia opens toward the sea near the old headland of Actium. On the 28th of September, 1538, the two fleets came within reach of one another. The winds were light, the morning clear, the tension immense. Doria, wary of a direct engagement against so unconventional an adversary and hampered by the competing interests and cautious counsels of his coalition, maneuvered and hesitated. Barbarossa, by contrast, acted with the single-minded focus of a commander who knew that his own survival and the Sultan's favor alike hung upon the day. He held his galleys in tight and disciplined order, used the confined waters and the failing wind against the heavier allied ships, and pressed his advantage where their superior numbers could not be brought to bear. What followed was less a sprawling melee than a lesson in position and nerve. As the hours passed, the Holy League found itself increasingly disordered, its vessels bunched and hindered by the very numbers that were meant to guarantee the victory, while the Ottoman galleys worked around them with fire and boarding. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, the momentum had shifted beyond recovery, and the Allied fleet withdrew in disarray, leaving Barbarossa in command of the water. Preveza resonated far beyond the immediate count of ships taken or sunk. It confirmed the Ottoman navy as the dominant force in the Mediterranean for a generation to come, and it proved that the empire was no longer merely a master of the walled city and the open plain, but a formidable sea power able to hold its own against the united strength of the West. This was ascendancy, not total possession. The corsairs of Christendom would still raid, and Malta and the western seas would remain contested, but for decades the balance would tilt the Sultan's way. Suleiman's patronage of a corsair out of Lesbos had returned a currency of prestige and security that few of his predecessors could have imagined. The Ottoman state now stood at the zenith of its outward strength, an empire of two seas and two continents whose influence was felt from the Atlantic approaches to the shores of the Indian Ocean. At the height of all this glory, the Sultan seemed to stand as the unchallenged arbiter of his age, the lawgiver, the conqueror, the patron of a golden era of stone and song, his poets celebrating him in verses of light and shadow, his administrators holding his vast and heterogeneous realm in a hard-won equilibrium. And yet he remained, as he had always been, a man defined by the solitude of his office. He had secured the seas and hardened the borders, but he had not secured the single thing on which the endurance of his house truly depended. The magnificence of the reign was a brittle thing, held together by the force of one man's will, and it was now being eroded from within. For the sons who were meant to carry his legacy forward were no longer children but grown men, each with his own ambition, his own following, and his own mother, all of them watching one another across the widening silence of the palace. At Preveza, the combined fleets of the Pope, the Emperor, and Venice fled before a single aging corsair, and the inner sea became, for a generation, a Turkish one. There seemed to be no limit at all to what this reign could take. But the true danger to the empire no longer lay on any sea or before any city wall. It lay in the women's quarters and the council chamber, in a single question that no conquest could answer and no law the lawgiver had ever written down could settle. Of all the Sultan's sons, which one would live to sit upon the throne, and which mother would see the others dead before him? The survival of the House of Osman had always been a matter of blood and hard necessity, a brutal arithmetic woven into the Ottoman state from its earliest days. To spare the realm the ruin of a divided inheritance, custom and law together permitted a sultan who gained the throne to put his own brothers to death, a sanction as ancient as it was terrible, justified in the chilling phrase of the old code as the price of the order of the world. The Habsburg ambassador Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq, who came to know the Ottoman court well, set the matter down without ornament. Among the Ottomans, he wrote, the brothers of a new sultan were doomed to certain death. In Suleiman's reign, the dread of that law shifted from brothers to sons. The sultan had reached the summit of his power, and yet he was held fast by the very tradition of succession he had inherited. He had several living sons, each a candidate for a single throne, and therefore each a mortal rival to the rest. In the eyes of the court, the army, and the empire, this was no longer a family. It was a field of competing lives on which the survival of one heir must, in the end, dictate the ruin of the others. The system that produced this cruelty had a logic of its own, and it is worth setting down plainly. The House of Osman knew no law of primogeniture, no settled rule that the eldest son, or any particular son, should follow his father. In principle, the throne fell to whichever prince could seize and hold it, as though survival itself were the judgment of God upon the man fittest to rule. To that end, the reigning sultan sent each of his grown sons out to govern a province of his own, with a household, a treasury, and a tutor, the lala, to school him in the arts of rule and to keep him, at the same time, at a wary distance from the capital. It was an apprenticeship and a quarantine at once. And when a sultan died, those seasoned governors became rivals in a headlong race for the throne, for the first son to reach the capital and gird himself with power might lawfully put the others to death to secure it. It was a system that, for all its brutal economy, all but ensured that brothers would one day face a choice between the throne and their own lives. The eldest and the most admired of them was Shehzade Mustafa. Born about 1515 to Mahidevran, the mother of the Sultan's early years, Mustafa had grown into precisely the man the empire hoped to see upon the throne. Serving as provincial governor, latterly at Amasya, on the empire's eastern flank, he had earned a name for justice and sound administration, and he carried himself with a martial bearing that reminded the older soldiers of Suleiman's own vigorous youth. To the Janissaries and to much of the populace he was the true heir, the golden prince around whom the hopes of the military establishment gathered like iron filings to a magnet. Mustafa had first held Manisa, the governorship nearest the capital that by long custom marked out the favored heir, before he was moved eastward to the more distant seat at Amasya. The shifting of these provincial posts was watched by the whole court as a barometer of a prince's standing, and men marked well that Manisa, the heir's own station, would in time pass to a son of Hurrem's. Against the line of Mustafa stood the sons of Hürrem, the woman who had risen from the enslaved ranks of the imperial household to become the Sultan's freed and lawful wife, an elevation that had already unsettled the oldest expectations of the dynasty. Her first son, Mehmed, had once been the brightest of hopes, but he had died of a sudden illness in 1543, a loss that struck his father hard. Suleiman would raise a great mosque in the capital, the work of Sinan, to keep the young prince's memory. Behind Mehmed there remained Selim and Bayezid, and the youngest, Cihangir, a gentle boy burdened all his life by physical frailty. And here the structural cruelty of the Ottoman system revealed itself in full. As a mother, Hürrem faced a reality as harsh as the law that framed it. So long as Mustafa lived, her own sons lived under the shadow of a prince who, on the day his father died and he mounted the throne, would hold the lawful power to end their lives in order to secure his own. This was the true and lethal architecture of the court, and it must be seen plainly because it is the ground on which a much darker story was later built. At the center of the capital's shifting loyalties stood Rustam Pasha, the shrewd and formidable Grand Vizier who had married the Sultan's daughter, Mihrima, a careful and sometimes ruthless administrator whose management of the empire's revenues had swelled the imperial treasury and who was reckoned the chief pillar of the party that favored Hürrem's line. Rustam had come up, like so many of the Sultan's foremost servants, out of the Balkans and through the Devshirme and the palace school. He had married Mihrima about the year 1539 and risen to the Grand Vizierate in 1544, and his genius was for the ledger, a hard and exacting master of revenue whose methods filled the treasury as surely as they earned him the resentment of those he taxed and those he passed over. The hostility between the friends of Mustafa and the household of Hürrem became an open secret in the halls of Topkapi, remarked upon by chroniclers and by the watchful ambassadors of foreign powers alike. The Venetian and Genoese reports of the years describe a court divided against itself, split between those who looked to the rising son of the eldest prince and those who staked their futures on the influence of the Sultan's wife and her son-in-law. Here we must draw a careful and unyielding line between what the record documents and what later ages have painted in the lurid colors of melodrama. The enduring narrative that Hürrem personally engineered the destruction of her rivals through poison and whispered deceit, working upon her husband's mind like a stage villain, belongs very largely to tradition and to hostile, often much later, retelling. It is the product of intense factional hatred in its own day and of centuries of European fascination since, and the plain record does not prove it. To say this is not to pretend the woman had no interests or no influence. She plainly had both. It is only to refuse to convict her in the narration of history of murders the sources cannot establish. And in truth, the myths were never needed, for the political reality was lethal enough on its own. Under the fratricidal law, every move Mustafa made was watched, and every report of his popularity with the troops could be turned by those who feared him into a weapon. By the early 1550s, Suleiman was a changed man. He was no longer the vigorous conqueror who had ridden to the gates of Vienna, but an aging sovereign worn by the long labor of rule, increasingly troubled by ill health, and drawn ever deeper into the isolation of his own court, ringed about by counselors whose own lives and fortunes were staked upon the outcome of the succession. More than 3 decades of unbroken war and government had told upon him. The vigorous horseman who had ridden to Mohács and Vienna was now a careworn and ailing man, and the compass of his world had narrowed to the space of a campaign tent and a council chamber. It was in this atmosphere of exhaustion and suspicion that the final mechanism began, slowly, to turn. The reports that reached the aging Sultan spoke of a climate of pervasive unease. It was whispered in the camps that Mustafa was no longer merely a prince awaiting his inheritance, but a man grown impatient for it, that he had courted the favor of the Janissaries so assiduously that he had begun to rival his father's authority while the Sultan still held the sword. The most enduring of these accounts came to be set down by Busbek, who reached Constantinople the year after the event and recorded the story as it was told to him, and it must be treated as a reflection of the atmosphere of those months rather than as unimpeachable fact. It was the story of a forged letter, a correspondence said to have been manufactured, purporting to pass between Mustafa and the Safavid Shah of Persia, in which the prince appeared ready to abandon his father's cause and make common purpose with the empire's chief enemy in the east. Whether such a letter ever existed, or whether it was the invention of the prince's rivals, the sources do not allow us to say. What the tradition insists upon is only that it was believed. To a sovereign already weary of the world and long weary of the very army he had commanded for decades, the mere charge of betrayal by his own blood needed no laboratory poison to do its work. So, at least, the chroniclers and ambassadors who wrote of these months understood it. The reports of the soldiers' devotion to the prince, meant to display the army's loyalty to the dynasty, were read at the Sultan's council as something else entirely, the gathering of a rival pole of power. The campaign the empire opened against the Persians in 1553 furnished the final stage. Far from the capital, in the remote reaches of the east, the isolation of the imperial court was absolute, and the open love the army bore Mustafa there, rather than reassuring the father, was taken by those around him as proof of everything they had long been telling him. By the autumn of 1553, the army in the field loved Mustafa openly. The whisper of a forged letter to the Shah of Persia had done its slow and poisonous work, and the old Sultan, 60 years old, sick and ringed by men who told him daily that his ablest son meant to take the throne while his father still breathed, made up his mind. He sent word for Mustafa to come to the imperial camp on the plain near Ereğli, to the great tent of his father. The prince came at once, and without the least fear, because he had done nothing wrong. It was the last mistake he would ever make. By the autumn of 1553, the imperial camp on the plain near Ereğli, in the heart of Anatolia, had become a vessel filled to its brim with rumor. The army had been raised for war against the Safavids of Persia, and it had marched east across the high tableland under the Sultan's own standard. But the true contest of that season was not with the distant Shah. It was being fought in the tents of the men who stood nearest to Suleiman, in the reports that reached his ear, in the slow, patient accumulation of suspicion around a single name. For months, the court had been thick with talk of Shehzadeh Mustafa, the eldest and the ablest of the Sultan's living sons, and the one the empire had long expected to reign. He was, by every account that has come down to us, the most admired prince of his generation. The making of such a prince was the work of a deliberate system. By the long custom of the House of Osman, a sultan's sons were sent out in adolescence to govern the provinces, each with a tutor guardian, a lala, at his elbow, and a court in miniature of his own, there to learn the handling of revenue, the management of men, and the conduct of war, an apprenticeship for a throne that only one of them would live to hold. Mustafa had served it longer and more brilliantly than any of his brothers. He had held the coveted governorship of Manisa, the seat nearest the capital and richest in prestige, before he was posted eastward to Amasya, and across more than 20 years of provincial rule he had grown into everything the training was meant to produce, seasoned in administration and in war, carrying himself with the bearing that older men remembered in his grandfather Selim and had seen in his father in the vigor of youth. The Janissaries spoke his name with open affection and looked to him as the soldier sultan they hoped one day to follow. Yet that very affection, which in a securer reign would have been the pride of the House of Osman, had in this one been turned into the instrument of his ruin. Under the Ottoman law of succession, there could be only one heir, and every son who lived was a rival to every other. A prince beloved of the army was, to a suspicious court, a prince already half in revolt. It did not help that Mustafa held Amasya far to the east, while the nearer princely seats had passed to the sons of Hurrem. For in the grammar of the dynasty, a man read the distance of a sun from the capital the way one reads the fall of the wind. The whisper that did the work was a letter, a document said to reveal Mustafa in secret correspondence with the Persian enemy, treating with the Shah for the throne while his father still lived. The eastern campaign of that year had been opened by the Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, sent ahead as its commander in the field, and it was from the army on the march that the reports against Mustafa traveled back to the Sultan. By the tradition later set down, the incriminating letter had been fashioned under a counterfeit of the prince's own seal, so that a treason he had never written appeared to carry his mark. Whether any such letter was genuine or was forged to destroy him, the sources could never agree. The tradition that it was a fabrication is reported by contemporaries, the Habsburg ambassador Busbek among them, but it is reported as rumor, not established as fact. What is certain is that the aging Suleiman, approaching 60, worn by long rule and ringed by counselors who told him daily that his ablest son meant to seize the throne, gave it credence. He summoned Mustafa to the imperial camp. The prince did not refuse and he did not flee. To flee would have been to confess the treason he had not committed. He came openly from his seat at Amasya with a small retinue and no army at his back, the conduct of a son answering his father's summons, not of a rebel marching to war. He rode into the camp at Aktepe, dismounted, and was led toward the great layered pavilion of the Sultan, to the audience he had been promised. The order had been settled before the prince ever reached the tent. On the 6th of October 1553, on his father's command, Shehzadeh Mustafa was strangled with a bowstring by the Sultan's mutes inside the imperial pavilion, in his father's name and with his father close at hand. For a while the vast camp beyond the tent knew nothing at all. When the news broke, it moved through the ranks like a sudden and violent weather. It was not only the loss of a prince, it was the loss of the future the soldiers had built their loyalty upon, the reign they had promised themselves. Grief came first, and then, hard behind it, a raw and dangerous anger. The men turned their fury upon those they held responsible for poisoning the father against the son, and above all upon the Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, who had commanded in the field and carried the Sultan's confidence. The camp that had been an ordered instrument of imperial power tilted, for a few hours, toward open mutiny. Suleiman, whose whole magnificence rested on the projection of an unshakable and divinely appointed order, met the fragility of that order in his own army. To quiet the fury, he did the one thing that would answer it. He stripped Rustem Pasha of the Grand Vizierate, handed the seals of office to Kara Ahmed Pasha in his place, and cast the fallen minister out of the inner circle to bear the soldiers' hatred away from the throne. It was a calculated retreat, a way to set distance between the Sultanate and the blood that had been spilled in its name, and for the moment it held. But the price could not be measured in a dismissed minister. The throne had been secured by the destruction of the heir the empire wanted, and the place Mustafa had filled would never be filled again. Rustem, once the storm had passed, would in time be restored to his office. The prince would not. The mourning was not confined to the camp. It ran the length of the empire, and it found its voice, as Ottoman grief so often did, in poetry. Poets who had spent their lives singing the glories of the Golden Age turned their pens to elegy, to laments for a spring cut down before its flowering. The most famous of them came from Tashlikalu Yahya, a soldier poet who had known the prince and whose verses were bold enough to carry the army's sorrow and to reproach by plain implication the men held to have engineered the fall. That such a lament could be written and survive and be recited is itself a measure of how deep and how public the wound had gone. It was no safe thing to write. The restored Rustem Pasha, it was said, never forgave the poet who had given the army's grief its voice. The prince's body was not left on the plain where he had fallen. It was carried westward to Bursa, the old first capital of the dynasty, and laid to rest among the tombs of the sultans and princes who had gone before him, buried with the honors of the very house that had killed him. His mother, Mahidevran, who had lost her long struggle with Hürrem years earlier and had now lost her son as well, withdrew to that same city to pass her remaining years beside his grave. She would outlive him by nearly 3 decades, kept in her last years by a pension from the half-brother who in the end came to the throne, so that the house which had taken Mustafa's life did not, at the last, leave his mother destitute. Within months, a second death followed the first. Shehzade Cihangir, the youngest of the Sultan's sons, frail in body from birth, had been devoted to his half-brother Mustafa. As the army wintered in the south at Aleppo, his health failed him, and he died there, still young. Later tradition tied his death directly to grief for the brother he had loved and lost, and that tradition may hold more than sentiment. But grief is not a cause a chronicler can prove, and it is enough to say that the house was now broken in a way no campaign could mend. Over the fall of Mustafa, the historians of later ages would argue without end, and the dominant tradition laid the blame upon Hürrem Sultan and her son-in-law Rustem, casting the Sultan's wife as the architect of the prince's ruin. That tradition must be handled with care, for it is drawn in large part from hostile and factional sources, and from the later legend that made her answerable for every sorrow of the dynasty. What can be stated plainly is the structural truth beneath the rumor. So long as Mustafa lived, the sons of Hürrem lived under the shadow of the fratricidal law and could inherit only if he did not. And beneath even that lies a fact no tradition can move. The order was the Sultan's own, given in his own camp, spoken in his own name. Whatever hands helped guide him toward it, the command that ended Mustafa's life was Suleiman's, and he never once, to anyone, explained it. The removal of the army's favorite did not settle the succession, it sharpened it. By striking down the one son whose claim the soldiers and the people had already accepted, Suleiman had not closed the question of who would follow him. He had thrown it open among the sons who remained and set them against one another with the same terrible logic that had just killed their brother. The magnificence of his public reign went on as though nothing had changed, the mosques rising under Mimar Sinan, the codified law binding the provinces, the fleet ranging the length of the Mediterranean. But behind that golden facade, the House of Osman had begun to consume itself, and the Sultan of the world was becoming year by year a lonelier man inside his own walls. It was done in the space of a few minutes, inside his father's tent, in his father's name, and when it was over, the most beloved prince of the age lay dead upon the carpet, while the army outside first wept and then dangerously began to rage. Suleiman had removed the son the empire wanted for its throne. He had not removed the problem, he had multiplied it. For behind Mustafa had stood the Sultan's other sons, the sons of Hürrem, and now that the eldest heir was gone, there was nothing left standing between them and one another. The death of Mustafa did not bring the silence the Sultan had reached for. It brought a vacuum, cold and hollow, and the sons who remained could not help but move to fill it. The Ottoman succession had never rested on the peace of primogeniture. It was a harder and older thing, a contest in which the throne passed not to the eldest son but to the son who could take and hold it, and in which the losers did not survive. That logic, which the killing in the tent at Ereğli had only sharpened, now bore down upon the last of Suleiman's heirs. The empire stood as vast and iron-willed as ever. The family at its center was splintering. Of all the sons who had once promised the House of Osman a long and stable future, only 2 of Hürrem's now remained to stand in their father's shadow. Selim, the elder, was a man of cautious temper and quiet habits, who sought his advancement in the favor of the court and the protection of the Sultan. From his seat at Manisa, the provincial governorship that by long custom lay nearest the capital and so nearest the throne, he governed without ambition enough to trouble his father. Bayezid the younger, ruling his own province from Kütahya, had the gifts the army prized, the charisma, the soldier's instinct, the boldness, and he had inherited, too, the affection the Janissaries had once given the dead Mustafa. Where Selim waited and cultivated, Bayezid gathered around himself the men who had mourned the lost heir and looked for another like him. The distance between the brothers was not a matter of temperament alone, it was a total failure of trust, and each had come to see the other as the last obstacle standing between himself and his own survival. Suleiman had set the precedent himself, and he could not now unset it. By permitting the destruction of Mustafa, he had shown the whole empire that no reputation, no popularity, and no talent bought a prince his safety, and in striking down the most balanced of his sons in the hope of forestalling a civil war, he had all but guaranteed that the rivalry of the 2 who were left would become a fight to the death. The court understood the change at once. Viziers, commanders, and the officers of the household began to hedge their loyalties, aligning themselves quietly with one brother or the other until the palace itself had become a map of divided allegiance and whispered calculation. While she lived, the brother's mother had worked to hold the peace between them. Hürrem is said to have stood as the one bond her sons still shared, mediating their quarrels and softening their father toward both. But in the spring of 1558 she died, and with her passing the last restraining hand was lifted from the rivalry. In the very year of her death, the Sultan moved to force his sons apart, ordering them to quit their old governments for new seats set deliberately far from one another. Selim was sent to Konya, in the heart of Anatolia. Bayezid was ordered away to the east, to Amasya, and Amasya was the seat that Mustafa had held before his fall, the province of the dead heir. To ease the command, Suleiman enlarged Bayezid's stipend by a great sum, but the sweetener could not disguise the meaning. Selim obeyed at once and rode to Konya. Bayezid obeyed only after long hesitation and read the arrangement for what, in the grammar of the dynasty, it plainly was, his father's judgment, rendered in the language of distance from the capital, delivered in favor of his brother, and delivered, at that, from the very ground of the brother they had already lost. The law he now faced was recorded, without pity and without illusion, by an outsider. The Habsburg ambassador, Ogier Giselin de Busbecq, an adversary and a stranger looking in from the edge of a rival world, whose account must always be read with that in mind, set down the grim arithmetic of the Ottoman house as the Turks themselves seemed to accept it, that the brothers of a new sultan are doomed to certain death because the peace of the realm was thought to require it. It was a law written in no code of the lawgiver, and yet it governed his sons more absolutely than any statute he had ever sealed. Bayezid did not intend to wait upon it. The collision came in the spring of 1559. Bayezid, seeing his father's favor settle openly upon his brother and his own position narrowing month by month, raised troops and marched against Selim. The 2 forces met on the plains near Konya on the 31st of May. It was not an even contest between brothers. Selim had at his disposal the Janissaries and household regiments that the Sultan placed at his service, and the veteran statecraft and disciplined command of Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, whom Suleiman had sent to sustain his chosen heir. Bayezid had the cavalry of his own province and the volunteers and adventurers who had gathered to his name. Backed by the whole weight of the Sultan's authority, Selim held the field. Bayezid's army was broken and scattered, and his bid for the throne shattered against the plain fact that his father had already chosen the other man. Even in defeat, the prince sent letters after his father, protesting that he had been driven to arms against his will and pleading to be forgiven. But the answer from the imperial camp was to proclaim him a rebel and to send soldiers to bring him in. For a defeated prince of the blood, there was no road back to mercy. To lose to a brother was to forfeit the right to live, and Bayezid understood what waited for him in the capital. Rather than return to that judgment, he took the only path a desperate man had left. He gathered his sons and a following still loyal to him and turned east, out of his father's reach, across the frontier into the lands of the Safavid Shah. It was an act of bitter and agonizing irony. Bayezid, an Ottoman prince, threw himself upon the mercy of Tahmasp of Persia, the very power against which his father had spent decades at war, the rival that stood for everything the Sunni Sultan claimed to defend. To save his life, he had fled to his father's oldest enemy. He did not go as a lone fugitive. Bayezid crossed the eastern marches with his sons riding beside him, and several thousand men still at his back. From the lost field at Konya he had fallen back first upon Amasya, and then driven east through the hard mountain country toward Erzurum and the Persian border, moving through the provinces while his father's forces gathered behind him in pursuit. When at last he passed into Safavid territory and came down to Tabriz, the Shah received him, at the first with the honor owed a king's son, lodged, feasted, and courted by a ruler who understood exactly what fortune had ridden into his hands. But a prince who has thrown himself upon an enemy has no power left to bargain with, and the honor shown him was a courtesy the Shah could withdraw the moment it ceased to serve. The flight sent a tremor through the whole of the Islamic East. In the Ottoman chanceries it was reckoned a catastrophe of the first rank. That a son of the Sultan should sit as a guest at the table of the Shah was at once a humiliation, a strategic danger, and an affront that could not be suffered to stand. A living claimant of the House of Osman, held in an enemy's hand, was a weapon that might be turned against the empire for years to come, loosed one day at the head of a Persian army, or kept simply as a standing threat to the peace of every succession to follow. Suleiman, who had brought kings low and reduced great cities to their foundations, now turned the whole grinding machinery of his diplomacy toward the Persian court. He sent letters, he sent gold, he sent, beneath the courtesies, the unmistakable threat of total war, and he demanded again and again the return of his son. Tahmasp played the long game, and a cynical one. He weighed the worth of a refugee prince against the cost of an Ottoman invasion, and he was in no haste to choose. He kept Bayezid in a gilded captivity, honored in appearance and a prisoner in fact, and used him as the bargaining piece he was, while the envoys of both the Sultan and the Crown Prince circled his court. The negotiations dragged across the better part of 2 years, protracted and agonizing, envoy answering envoy, the sum demanded and the price of it rising by the season. And the Sultan's demand did not stop at the person of the prince. It reached to his whole line, the young sons who had ridden east with him, and even an infant boy of his left behind in Anatolia, for by the pitiless arithmetic of the succession no branch of a rebel's blood could be suffered to remain, nor did the pressure come from the old Sultan alone. Selim, watching from his province, had every reason his father had to want the matter closed and his rival gone, and his own envoys pressed the Persian court as hard as the Sultan's. For so long as Bayezid lived, even a captive on foreign soil, the succession Selim had won at Konya was not yet safe. Worn down from every side, and bought at last with a staggering weight of gold, the Shah let go of the doomed man he had sheltered, and gave the prince up to the agents his father had sent. In 1561 the executioners sent out from Istanbul did their work in a house near Kazvin, and Bayezid and his sons were put to death on Persian soil, sold back to their father for a weight of gold. Of all the sons Hürrem had borne him, only one was left alive now, Selim, the one a later age would name the sot, and the ablest branches of the House of Osman had been cut away by the Sultan's own hand. The killing was finished at last. But Hürrem, who had borne every one of them, was already 3 years in her grave, and the old man who had outlived his friend, his wife, and the best of his sons was now more alone than any conqueror had ever been in the history of the world. The death of Hürrem in the spring of 1558 fell over the inner world of the Sultan like a silence that would not lift, a stillness so deep it seemed to settle into the very stone of the capital. For more than 30 years she had been the single fixed point of his private life. She was the correspondent who had received his letters from the far edges of the empire and answered them, the partner who had shared the weight of the imperial household, the one person in his world who did not stand before him only as a subject. When she was laid to rest, it was not in some quiet corner of the palace, but beneath a domed tomb of rare grace raised for her by Mimar Sinan, the master builder whose work had reshaped the skyline of the age. Her turban rose beside the great Süleymaniye mosque he had lately completed for the Sultan. Its doors had opened only the year before in 1557, after some 7 years' labor, a monument in stone and tile to a bond that had broken every rule the Ottoman court had made to prevent it. With her passing, the last of the voices that had known Suleiman in his younger and more vivid years fell quiet. What she left behind was not a silence only. Across the empire stood the works of her own patronage, the great charitable foundation in the capital that carried her title, with its mosque, its college, its soup kitchen for the poor, and its hospital for the sick. The bath she had raised beside the great mosque of Hagia Sophia, the pious endowment that fed pilgrims and the destitute as far away as Jerusalem, a hospice and public kitchen there sustained from the revenues of whole villages that would go on feeding the poor and the traveler for centuries after the hand that founded it was dust. This was the documented Hürrem, the woman of intelligence and reach whom the record actually preserves. Not the poisoner of later legend, but a queen who had turned an unprecedented power towards stone and charity that would outlast her by centuries. She had risen from a slave market to stand beside the master of the world, and she had used the height she reached to build. The house was emptying, and much of it had been emptied by his own hand. Ibrahim, the friend he had once loved beyond any man, had been more than 20 years dead. Shehzade Mehmed, the son of early promise, had died of illness in 1543 while still young. Mustafa, whom the army had loved, and the gentle Cihangir had both been lost in the same dark season of 1553. Now Hürrem was gone, and within a few years the last struggle against Bayezid would clear the final rival from the board, on the far side of the Persian frontier. Suleiman had built a world of unmatched order, a vast and ticking mechanism of law and tribute and command, and he had built it in the end by pruning the branches of his own dynasty until only one was left standing. He remained, but he stood among absences, the absence of those he had loved and the absence of those he had ordered to die. The Sultan who moved through the late 1550s and the early 1560s was, by the one detailed account that survives, a figure of worn and somber dignity. Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq, the Habsburg ambassador at Constantinople in those years, watched the Ottoman court with the sharp and judging eye of a man sent from a rival power, an outsider and an adversary, whose portrait must always be read with that caution in view. He left even so one of the few true windows we have onto the aging man, a sovereign pale and sallow of complexion, his face marked by the long years of rule, yet carrying a majesty that neither age nor infirmity could dim. Busbecq noted, too, a detail that would later harden into legend, that at a formal audience, to impress the envoy of a foreign prince, the Sultan's face had been given an artificial color, painted to make him appear in better health than he was. It was the small, telling vanity of a state that could not afford to let the world see how frail its master had grown. For frail he was. Suleiman was increasingly crippled by gout, a condition that could hold him immobile for months at a stretch and drove him back from the public eye. More and more the daily business of the empire passed into the hands of his ministers, to Rustem Pasha until his death in 1561, and then to the brilliant Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, who would guide the state through its master's last years and beyond. Sokolu was himself a child of the Devshirme, a Bosnian taken into the palace and risen through it much as Ibrahim had a lifetime before. He would take the Grand Vizierate in full in 1565 and prove the ablest statesman of the age, the pillar on whom the end of the reign and much of what came after it would rest. The empire did not falter for the Sultan's withdrawal. The bureaucracy was too deep, the law too firmly codified, the momentum of the whole too great to be checked by one old man's grief. But the withdrawal was real, and it was near total. Not every intimate had been taken from him. His daughter Mihrima Sultan, the child of his marriage to Hürrem and the one who had outlived her mother, remained at the very center of the court. And after Hürrem's death she stepped into much of the place her mother had filled as the foremost woman of the dynasty. She wrote to her father, managed the charities and the affairs of the imperial household, and carried a political weight that foreign envoys were careful to court. For her, too, the architect Sinan raised mosques at Üsküdar on the Asian shore and, later, at the land walls beside Edirne, as he had for Hürrem. In the thinned company of his last years she stood, with Sokolu, among the very few who moved close to the aging Sultan. He turned, in those years, toward the consolations of faith and the long backward look of the poet. writing still under the name Muhibi, the lover. The Sultan, who had once filled his verses with the fire of his devotion to Hürrem, now wrote in a colder and quieter key. He was, in the reckoning of later scholars, among the most prolific poets the Ottoman world produced. The divan he left under that name runs to thousands of verses, one of the largest bodies of poetry ever set down by a reigning sovereign. His late poetry turned away from the world it had once embraced and toward the transience of all things beneath heaven, the vanity of power, the certainty of death, the return of the soul to the God who had lent it. The turn was of a piece with the temper of these last years, in which the court itself moved toward a stricter and more sober observance, and the Sultan, who in his younger reign had kept a more worldly household, inclined ever more toward the mosque and the plain devotions of an old man. He had commanded the earth for a lifetime, and in the private hours of his old age he seemed, in his own written words, to be readying himself for the day the earth would have no further use for him. It is the closest we may honestly come to his inner life, not what a chronicler imagined he felt, but what the sovereign himself chose to set down. This was the deep paradox of the Golden Age. The very instruments that had carried the empire to its summit, the concentration of all things in the Sultan's single will, the cold efficiency of the dynastic purge, the elevation of proven talent over the accident of birth, had produced a state of perfect stability that was also quietly hollowing from within. By clearing away the rivalry among his sons, Suleiman had made certain that no brother would kill another for his throne, but he had also left that throne to Selim, a man who carried neither the warrior's temper nor the poet's fire, and whom a later age would remember as the Sot. The seeds of what the chroniclers would one day call the Sultanate of women, and of the long, slow loosening of central authority, were being sown in these grief-quieted rooms, in a palace that had come to feel more like a mausoleum than a seat of power. The magnificence endured, in the architecture, in the law, in the sheer reach of the frontiers. But the pulse of the man who had driven it all was beginning to fail, and yet the instinct of the conqueror had not died with the rest. The borders of the empire were not fixed lines on a map but living things, and in 1566 word came from the north that the old contest in Hungary had flared once more into a war for the border fortresses. A client prince appealing for the Sultan's protection, the Habsburgs letting their agreed tribute lapse, the frontier forts changing hands. Set beside the vast campaigns of the 1530s, it was a small thing, a speck on the great chart of his life. But it was a matter of the law and a matter of honor, and the Sultan, who had not ridden out of his capital in years, declared that he would lead the campaign in person. His physicians, his ministers, and his household begged him to remain. He could no longer sit a horse, and the road, they warned, would surely kill him. He would not hear it. He was the lawgiver, he was the Sultan, and the banner of the House of Osman would be carried into the field by no hand but his own. He was 71 years old, crippled with gout, so worn and ill that he had to be carried in a curtained litter, and, it was said, his grey face reddened with paint, so the army would not see how near to death he already was. Every counsellor he had begged him to remain in Istanbul. He would not hear of it. One more time the lawgiver would ride to war in his own person, north into Hungary where his glory had first begun, to a small and stubborn fortress on a marsh whose name almost no one in Europe had ever heard. He would not come back from it alive, and neither, for many days after, would anyone in the world be permitted to know that he was gone. The fortress of Szigetvar was a stubborn thing of earth and timber set in a Hungarian marsh, held by a few thousand men under a Croatian nobleman, Nikola Šubić Zrinski. To the Sultan, it was the last irritant defiance on the long road toward Vienna, a small obstacle that would not yield. Suleiman watched the siege through the heavy curtains of his tent, his joints swollen with the gout that had shadowed his final years, his breath come short. He was 71 years old, a survivor out of a vanished world. He had outlived his generation, his friend, his wife, and the best of his sons. He remained the master of a vast and glittering mosaic of peoples, but the private map of his life had been rendered nearly barren, and much of it by the very decisions he had taken to secure it. He had not set out to take this fortress. When the old Sultan led his army out of Istanbul on the 1st of May, 1566, Towersize, his 13th campaign and the longest march of his old age, his design was a larger one, aimed by way of the Hungarian forts at the Habsburg power itself, for the Emperor Maximilian had let the agreed tribute lapse, and the frontier had flared once more into raiding war. It was Szigetvar's own defender who drew the whole weight of that army down upon his walls. In the weeks before, Zrinski had ridden out from the fortress and cut to pieces an Ottoman column and its baggage near Siklos, and the affront turned the campaign aside from its wider purpose. The Sultan resolved to reduce the stronghold of the man who had dealt the insult before he would go on to anything else. It was the last decision of his long life that would shape a field of battle. The siege dragged on through the heavy heat of late summer 1566. The fortress had been invested since the first days of August, its garrison of some 2,000 or 3,000 set against a host that may have numbered 100,000 and more, and still it would not break. The Ottoman guns battered the walls, and the Sultan's engineers drove their tunnels beneath the ramparts, but Zrinski held with a ferocity that seemed to feed on the very hopelessness of his cause. Within the imperial camp, the mood was one of stifled, anxious formality. The officers of the court, and the Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha above them all, moved with the measured tread of men balancing the weight of an empire upon a dying man's pulse. They understood that the instant Suleiman ceased to breathe, the whole vast structure of the state would shudder. The succession had been settled by attrition. Selim II was the only candidate left alive, but in the Ottoman world the death of a sultan was always the signal for possible chaos, and the army was many weeks' hard march from the capital. The end came in the night between the 6th and the 7th of September. In the close stillness of his tent, as the siege guns kept up their hollow rhythmic thudding against the walls, the Sultan died, of age and long illness, with the fortress he had come to take poised on the very edge of falling. There was no proclamation, no last testament, and no dying speech. The record preserves no final words. There was only the sudden and absolute silence of a man who had commanded the world for 46 years. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha did not hesitate. He grasped at once that an army which learned its sovereign was dead might come apart, and that the long road home would then run through every danger of a leaderless state. So he gave out that the Sultan's health had merely worsened, and that he was directing the siege still from within his quarters. He closed the imperial tent to all but a handful of trusted servants. A persistent and grim tradition would later hold that the Sultan's own physician was killed in those first hours to still the one voice that could confirm the death, whether truth or a dark thread of folklore. It cannot now be known, but the secrecy itself was real and near absolute. For some 48 days the fiction of a living Sultan was sustained. Orders went out in his name. The army was told he still governed from his tent. When the fortress at last was stormed, Zrinski falling with the last of his garrison in a final sortie as the walls were overwhelmed, and the powder magazine of the inner castle blowing up beneath the attackers as they poured in, so that the stronghold killed hundreds of its captors even in the moment of its own fall. A day or so after the Sultan he had defied was already dead. The victory was celebrated as a triumph the master had lived to see. And when the army turned at last for home, the body of the Sultan was carried with it, borne along in his curtained carriage as though he were a ruler resting on the march. The soldiers who guarded it saw only their sovereign at the heart of his army, and did not know that they kept watch over a corpse. It was a macabre and formidable deception, and a deliberate one, a final act of statecraft meant to carry the crown intact from a tent in Hungary to Selim II in the capital, and to give the empire no gap of open air into which a rival might rush. The deception reached beyond the siege lines, and Sokolu had grasped for its true purpose in the first hours. A secret rider was sent ahead to Selim in his province to bring him racing to the capital before any rumor of the death could run loose. Until the heir was safely upon the throne, no word would be spoken aloud. Selim reached Istanbul and was girded with the sword of his ancestors at the shrine of Eyüp, the old rite that made a man an Ottoman sultan, while his father's embalmed body still traveled the roads of the Balkans in its curtained litter. The soldiers who had borne him learned the truth only near the journey's end, and, denied in a single stroke both the mourning owed their dead sultan and the accession bounty owed them by a new one, they came close to open tumult before the young sultan's authority was steadied. The return to Istanbul was a funeral procession that dared not name itself. Only when the truth could no longer be held back was it released, and the sultan interred with all the solemnity owed the man who had defined the century. By the tradition of the time, it was said that his heart and inner organs were buried on the field of his last campaign at Shigetvar, tethering the conqueror forever to the last patch of ground he had sought to win. Whether or not it is so, his body was carried home to the capital he had remade. There it was laid in the tranquil, domed tomb beside the Suleymaniye Mosque, close by the resting place of Hurrem, who had gone before him, the two of them brought together again in the shadow of the great mosque that bore his name. Suleiman left behind an empire that stood, by every outward measure, at its zenith. He had been the architect of a body of law that gave order to a sprawling and many-peopled realm, the patron of an age of building led by Mimar Sinan that had turned the skyline of Istanbul into a forest of domes and slender minarets, and a poet whose verses under the name of Muhibi reflected a genuine, searching, and deeply human spirit. His reign had been the long golden afternoon of the House of Osman, and yet it is not possible to survey that glory without seeing the deep structural fractures he himself had authored. The seeds of the long decline that historians would later trace were planted in the very soil of his triumphs. By clearing away his ablest sons, Mustafa, who had been the hope of the army, Bayezid, the rival his own hand had driven into flight and death, Suleiman had left the throne to Selim II, whom history would remember as the Sot. The space where his stronger heirs should have stood would be filled instead by court factions and the power of the household, opening the era in which the Sultanate would often be steered from behind the curtain rather than from the throne. This is not to say that the empire fell; it remained vast and formidable for generations yet. But the clear, strong line of succession that had carried the House of Osman up through its long rise had been broken here at the very noon of its power by the man who embodied that power most completely. The tragedy of Suleiman the Magnificent is that he held the strength to reshape the world and could not master the impulses of his own house. He was the lawgiver who could not govern the hearts of his own children, the conqueror who had stood at the gates of Vienna and on the banks of the Euphrates, and who passed his last years walled off by the very magnitude of the choices he had made. The friend he had once loved above all others was sacrificed to the demands of power. The son he had once been proudest of was destroyed by the whispers of the court and by his father's own cold, unbending sense of dynastic duty. Every historian who has read the record of his reign has had to reckon with this same duality. The darkness cannot be cut away from the light because both were fed from a single source, the same ambition, the same hunger for order, the same terrible and deepening solitude. He was a man who held that the greatness of the state could justify the suffering of any single soul, even when that soul was his own blood, his own friend, his own self. He raised a mosque that reached toward heaven, and he presided over a family that collapsed into dust. So the greatest of all the sultans died in a tent in a foreign marsh, in the dark, a few hundred yards from a burning fortress, and for 48 days the men around him carried his body at the head of an army and told the world that he still lived. It is perhaps the truest single image we have of him. The magnificence was real, the law, the mosque, the poem, the empire at its dazzling and unrepeatable height, and so was the shadow. The friend and the son strangled at his quiet word, the house he emptied with his own hand. They were never two men, the magnificent and the destroyer. They were one man, the most magnificent and the loneliest who ever wore the crown of Osman, and he had made himself so. That is the secret the golden legend was built so carefully and for so long to hide.